Okay, I think we're live. I see at least one person in the comments. Somebody want to let us know if we have audio or if there's any issues. Didn't. I don't know. Yeah, let us know if there's audio or if.
What did he say?
I don't know.
There's a line above that. I just can't read this far.
Oh, don't really like the pastor, but I like the rest of those who go there.
Who is that?
Yes, I'm going to visit my church. Lab Sensei invited. Yeah, a lot of my audience has a similar attitude about institutional church. So I pretty much always bring up real life post falls when I want to criticize institutional church, in general, because they're the largest church around here. But they're not as bad as a lot of mega churches, because the pastor actually says things that are meaningful and correct and sometimes insightful. And I think there's a handful of people who attend because of that pastor and the meaningful things that he has to say. Some of the associate pastors, though, are just, I don't know, sickening. So,
Only been, I think I went to the Post Fall one and the Coeur d'Alene one. I actually liked the Coeur d'Alene one. I bumped into some nice people who went there at Union, but they all failed my brunch test.
What's the brunch test?
It's weird to be on camera. I think if you go around at a church and you go up to groups afterwards and you're generally being social and you're just sort of being like, hey, what's everyone doing after church? And you don't get a single invite to brunch. That is just not a church that is focused on any sort of outreach, building community,
fellowship in general.
Yeah. And I've had that experience at a few little small churches out in Seattle, as well as I guess here as well. And it's people do that. Because obviously, not everyone goes out for food. Families are less likely to do that, and there's all sorts of things. But a group of young people at a church should be welcoming to other young adults.
Yeah.
I always tried to do that when I was going to that Pentecostal church in Coeur d'Alene, and so I would make it a point to go up to every new person. And part of that is a recruiting tactic. And so it's not just that they're not offering fellowship; it's that they're not kind of thinking in terms of expanding and recruiting. And if they are thinking about expanding and recruiting, they're not thinking about it in a reasonable way. So they're not friendly or not competent.
People are also decidedly boring and uninteresting. It's kind of like the
point of view.
The YouTube video that you're currently watching is not nearly as interesting as the next one might be, right? So there's something similar with people where when there's a new person, you just never know. That might be the most interesting person in the world. And it's not until you get to know somebody that you can rule out that possibility. So, but yeah, the people that we know are kind of like the YouTube videos we're currently watching, in my opinion. So,
yeah, it's possible also that if I returned a few times, there was some you have to show up a certain number of times before we care kind of threshold that I didn't need. But you'd think new people are interesting.
Yeah, no, I've been to churches that are all over you when you're new. They they need your contact info because an email capture and of course your address, because they're going to email you stuff or send you stuff in the mail to keep you coming back.
Yeah, everyone does that, but I don't really want to add my name to an email list. I want to talk to someone one-on-one and see if they're a good person. Or I just want to go to brunch and I want to go with other people.
Yeah. And if you make a habit of alienating all of the people that you already know, going to church is a good way to have people to go to brunch with, because they haven't figured out what kind of person you are yet.
I have people to go to brunch with, but
I feel like a church like Real Life, which is just like every other church, you have a worship service that nobody's interested in because it's like a professional concert where all the worship staff are paid regular salaries and nobody sings along because you wouldn't be able to hear yourself over the noise of all of the band and everything. And people just sort of tolerate it. And for some reason, the staff is not, they're not aware that that's happening because they've like never looked out at the audience to see that like everybody's just kind of like waiting for it to be over.
Yeah, I think I went to the one in Post Falls 2 weeks in a row, and the first time, sort of coming from a small little church, I definitely like sang along, but like kind of felt like no one else around me was singing. And the next week, it was just like I kind of don't want to do it. And I just left actually like halfway through. I was like, this is kind of silly.
Mm-hmm. The last, like I went to the Real Life in Post Falls for quite a while, maybe a year and a half, kind of off and on. And maybe the last 5 times I attended, I didn't make it past the coffee shop into the sanctuary, the service, because there was a lot more interesting things going on in just talking to my kids while we had coffee. And for a while, they would put the sermon on a big monitor and you could hear it. And that was fun because we could sort of talk about the sermon as they were talking. I could say, yeah, here's why this is wrong. And this is an interesting point. And, so we sort of live critique the sermons, and you could do that from the coffee shop, but you couldn't do that from inside. And then for some reason, they just muted the audio. And so then going to Real Life was basically going to the coffee shop and waiting around for either the service to be over so we could maybe talk to a few random people, or just until we got sick of sitting there in the coffee shop, then we'd go to the thrift store and buy cheap sleds or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's something with once the church gets to a sufficient size, especially if it's we both, I guess, live here, and it's socially required in many ways, or in some circles, to go to church. So you have people who are just kind of going to church to fulfill some sort of obligation. Yeah. And so you just kind of go in, you grab your coffee, everything's conveniently there, and then you leave. And there's no sort of desire for community, but it's sort of unreasonable to even expect these people to want that because they're not really there for any purpose other than just to be there.
Yeah, it really irritates me that there's a lot of greeters who wear very fake smiles, who pretend like they're excited that you're here and pretend like they're happy to be there, but it's blatantly obvious that they're pretending. And when you look around and you see like out of 10 people in front of you, 9 of them have fake smiles pasted on, there's something just fundamentally wrong with what they're doing if that is occurring. And feel free to disagree, but what if they took advantage of the people who are already attending, the buildings and the resources that they have, and instead of doing like a concert and then having somebody say a bunch of stuff, most of which isn't true if it's the associate pastors, what if they had like circular tables and they just filled the room with circular tables with maybe 10 to 15 people at each table? And they had somebody who was kind of like an MC who said, today we're going to discuss 1 Peter chapter 1. So everybody read it at your table and then talk about it. And then afterwards, make sure you invite somebody to go to brunch. And like, that's what they did. And so the pastor spent literally like a minute and a half to say something like what I just said.
Yeah, I talk a lot about, I think, church as modeling off of these sort of educational institutions. And I think it's worth noting that the church started a lot of these colleges and universities back in the day, so I don't think it's an unreasonable comparison. But if you look at starting like in high school, if you go to sort of high schools geared towards college and some prep class, like all of my high school classes were in sort of a large Harkness table. It was expected that all of the learning would be done sort of discussion based. You would come having already read your history textbook and you would discuss it the idea that you would be spending money on tuition to like just listen to someone talk to you is kind of like a waste. It's kind of ingrained in us. And then when you go to college, you know, there's this format of professor's lecture. It's going to be streamed online anyways. You probably don't have to go. Some people did. Sometimes the best version of the lecture wasn't your professor, it was some other professor from a few years ago. So it, like, you would get together with your friends and watch like a previous year's stream. But then there was sort of the recitation component, which is a smaller group of people, discussions led by either grad students or a professor, depending on the department, and like more stuff got done there. And then the actual learning happened when you kind of sat together for your problem sets with like 4 or 5 friends and just kind of worked into the, you know, wee hours of the morning. And I think if that works for every other type of learning, would probably work for church as well.
Yeah, historic Christianity, what it sort of became, which was like a hierarchy that governs loosely and has some kind of presumed divine authority. You know, when Christianity became the Holy Roman Empire, you had this mix of religious ideas that started with Jesus, but then greatly evolved into kind of what they are now, which is like I don't even know what the name for it is, but it's this idea that being right with God is a matter of swearing loyalty to whatever the authority, in this case the Holy Roman Catholic Empire, has deemed to be the critical sets of word salads, right? So this idea that it's not about Christ-likeness, it's about having the correct sets of propositions that you are loyal to or whatever. Then you have to have the institution that maintains that set or subset of ideas that are like the critical set of ideas. And it's not like the Bible says, these are the things that Jesus taught that you have to believe, and these are the things that Jesus taught that are optional. And since there isn't really any way to sort out Jesus's teachings based on, I don't know, what's rational or whatever, you have to have somebody with the presumed divine authority to sort that out for you and create things like the 5 solas or the doctrine of the Trinity, or the, like, Real Life has their statement of faith where they, based on some presumption of having divine right or divine authority similar to the Catholic Church, are telling you these are the things in our statement of faith that are optional, and these are the things that if you don't believe them, you're going to burn in hell for eternity. So church authority, though, is or church as an institution isn't trying to like educate you to become Christ-like. Church institutions exist basically to maintain themselves. Like any large organism, its primary function is to maintain itself and get larger. And Real Life is a perfect example of an organization that exists to maintain itself and get larger. That's like why they redefine discipleship. So,
yeah, I guess background, since it's on a live stream, I don't know if anyone cares, but I did not grow up in a church or religious at all, so it doesn't strike me as odd at all to say that churches, being somewhat bureaucratic in nature, exhibit all the other properties that bureaucracies have, which is a focus on their own continuation, the employment of everyone within them, and gaining more power if that's beneficial for the individual members.
not members of the church, but
members, yeah, the bureaucracy itself. So the staff, the worship team, I guess in a Catholic sense, your priests, your sort of hierarchical.
Yeah, so like when I was attending a small group at Real Life, I asked the small group leader, and in fact, I just brought it up, this question of how is it that Real Life Church is able to decide these teachings of Jesus and the apostles matter, and these teachings of Jesus and the apostles don't matter? Like, what's their criteria? And their criteria is, well, it's decided by the elder board. Okay, so how is the elder board deciding this? Well, they're elders. They have the ability to make these decisions. Well, how did they become elders? Well, by the laying on of hands of the previous elders. Well, where did the first elder come from? Well, the first elder is the head pastor. How did he become the head pastor? And if you're trying to trace, like, where does this divine authority to categorize Jesus's teachings as important or unimportant, like back to its origin, it just kind of goes nowhere. The Catholic faith, at least they attempt to answer this question by claiming that the authority goes back to Peter, who Jesus laid hands on directly. And Peter was sort of the first pope, and he laid hands on whoever was next, and that succession continues all the way to the existing pope. So they have a better argument than real life for this sort of claim to be able to have this divine authority to sort out which things you have to believe in order to be saved or not. The Catholic Church, of course, teaches that there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. And if you try to argue with somebody who is a Catholic about, like, what matters, the first and foremost argument is going to be for the divine authority of the Catholic Church. So, like, that's the critical thing. And it makes sense that that would be important to them, because according to the Catholic Church, there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. So you have to attend and you have to be under their authority, and there has to be some pronouncement or signing of something or whatever, or you're just flat out not saved.
Yeah, I think I think there's two things there. The Catholic kind of critique of the lack of apostolic succession in Protestant churches, I think, is sort of valid. When you are just going to create these strange lists of these are okay and these are not, because it's more transparently self-serving when it's happening, in 1980 in Post Falls, Idaho, as opposed to thousands of years ago.
Right.
I view the Catholic Church's initial claims with the same sort of, these are probably just people who are maintaining their bureaucracy, but it definitely passes the initial, like, smell test in a way that real life does not. And yeah, I think Catholics place a large emphasis on, I guess, receiving grace through the sacraments, and you just can't get the sacraments without the church. So they've kind of just arranged themselves as the monopoly of providing these particular services.
Yeah.
Um,
And then they have a kind of justification for it, or a claim of justification through the succession thing. And Protestantism is basically trying to be what the Catholic Church is, but without anything to do with Catholics. So they shoot themselves in the foot in a weird way.
I imagine that a lot of them have some version of apostolic succession, because it's, I'm sure there were Catholics that converted in the 16 and 1700s whenever these various.
It would make sense, but like, I've never heard any Protestant church argue anything like that.
I would be curious if you had, like, you have degrees of, like, how, like, the Lutherans, for instance, or the Anglicans, I think, have a more clear, they feel more Catholic when you attend their services. They care about the sacraments. They're the real presence in the Eucharist and all that jazz. And so I imagine that they probably have apostolic succession if they, like, check their records. And I'm curious how the Catholics feel about those Protestants that believe in all the sacraments. They have a direct line to Peter. They're just not giving money to Rome. Something tells me that the important thing is the submission and transfer of material resources to the Catholic Church, more so than anything else. But
with a large church like Saddleback, for example, and Rick Warren literally wrote the book on a Protestant version of this idea. The megachurch pastor, who is the head pastor, has something like the divine authority that the Catholic Church claims. They call it vision casting, which I think is a weird name, but the claim is that God singled out a person like Rick Warren and then gave him sort of a prophetic vision and then the resources to be able to start something as big as Saddleback Church, which is one of the largest churches in the world.
How big is it?
I think there's like 14,000. You'd have to Google it, but it's one of the largest churches, like in the United States, at least. As far as the physical building and how many people attend on a Sunday, and of course they've got all the satellite campuses. And Rick Warren wrote the second most published book in the world, The Purpose-Driven Life. But his largeness and the power that he wields as the head pastor of one of the largest Christian organizations is sort of put forward, and implicitly his endorsement from God. So I have divine authority. Look at how big and powerful I am. God gave me all of this power. If you question me, you're questioning God. It's sort of implied. They wouldn't necessarily state it directly, but it's very much implied.
I mean, I look at that, and again, not having grown up in the church, most of these names I've only really heard them. I've never really watched any of this stuff, but it's like 14,000 people, and you get people for a couple hours a day. Like, I'm sure there are maybe two orders of magnitude, like more Christians working for Walmart for their entire week.
Yeah.
Definitely worked in companies that have very cultish cultures. Probably have a larger influence on how I think than attending this church. And I don't think anyone says that like Sam Walton or Bezos or anyone else is, divinely appointed by God. I guess Joe Rogan has an enormous audience relative to that as well. So it seems there are plenty of people with larger audiences who give moral or.
Yeah, but like Joe Rogan is not teaching people God stuff, right? Rick Warren is teaching people God stuff.
Well, it's like sort of like in a nutshell, it's like how to live and what to believe.
Yeah, but when you attach this claim to it, like if you hear the story of Jim Putman, who is the pastor, he's the head pastor at Real Life in Post Falls, and he's apparently a personal friend of Rick Warren. And Real Life Post Falls is a church of more than 10,000 people every Sunday. It is a mega church. He tells the story of going from being just like a normal dude who was a state champion wrestler and relatively successful at things that he was doing, but lacking direction or something. And then all of a sudden, like all of these mysterious coincidences just fell into place for him to be motivated to start a church, and then to suddenly have like this huge building and all of the resources, and people started attending. And he credits God with him going from like zero religious association or interest to suddenly having this huge church. And his story is very, very compelling. Like it sounds very much like it was divine providence that enabled him to create Real Life Church. And that story sounds like an endorsement from God.
Is his claim that if like his statement of faith had one or two items moved either from the required to the optional, or from the optional to the required, that he would not have been as successful?
No, they avoid questions like that. Like nobody who attends Real Life is asking those questions. I was asking those questions, and I was ousted from the small group, and they made it clear that they didn't want people even bringing to light the fact that the elders are somehow deciding which teachings of Jesus matter and which ones don't. Like you can't get away from the fact that that's what they're doing, because in their statement of faith, these things are optional, and these things you have to believe or you're not saved. Based on what criteria? It's not like there's some like evidently rational way of sorting out the teachings of Jesus into you must believe or you must not believe. And they all have this underlying assumption that salvation is contingent upon sort of the five solas idea, or some ideas that are sort of implicit that salvation is in some way contingent upon accepting sets of propositions rather than on like Christ likeness. The New Testament teaches very plainly, as we've discussed numerous times, that the saving grace of God teaches us to deny ungodliness and the lusts of the flesh and live soberly and righteously. A life that produces the fruits of the Spirit, that doesn't make any room for sin. the kind of person who is a righteous person, who is a good tree, whose mind has been transformed by the teachings of Christ, such that their heart, their feelings, their emotions, their mind, and their actions are all pure and good and righteous. So it's a good tree that is producing good fruit. These are the kinds of people who are fit for the kingdom of heaven. Now, Protestant Christianity teaches something very different. It teaches that people who accept a set of propositions, but who are internally always going to be wicked, will inherit the kingdom of heaven based on a legal loophole that Christ's righteousness is transferred to their account. So righteousness is impossible in the mind of a Protestant and unnecessary because Jesus has satisfied the legal loophole so that God can like legally allow wicked people into his kingdom by basically fixing the books.
Yeah, I guess like, going back to like I brought up Sam Walton. These churches are functionally businesses. I don't, having never, some I'm sure are in the business of changing people's lives, but most just want you to say you believe certain things, give them money, and I guess I'm just very cynical on that.
Yeah, you started with talking about your college experience of learning. Churches are not trying to train people to the level that they, like the staff doesn't want the congregation to be more competent in the Bible than them so that they don't need to attend anymore on Sundays.
Yeah.
That is contrary to the bureaucratic approach of growing the organism and sustaining the organism. That's just a completely different thing. So any institutionalized church, at least any that I've ever observed, is not interested in actually making disciples.
I think I've said a lot when I sort of talk about our church that it's modeled on like sort of a grad school model. Mm-hmm. I guess for viewers that aren't familiar, in graduate school, you kind of, there's some coursework where you're kind of focused on research. And the end goal of grad school is for the professor to produce other aspiring professors. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this lab that I attended is a good lab because it has, you know, alumni in all these other institutions. And if you went there and they said, actually, none of our alumni have graduated, they've all been here for 30 years, you wouldn't join that lab. At least
never happened, but
no, there are labs, you know, that maybe the professor wants to research a little bit. I was in robotics, a little more hardware. Hardware adds a couple of years. So you're like, kids stay around here longer. Maybe I want to not join this lab. Bio is also notoriously, it takes a long time. So you just kind of avoid those fields if you're making a decision about shortening it. And so it's like very odd to have a learning institution where you remain a perpetual student. And then you also witness, you know, people just, even in a year or two attending a church, they repeat themselves. They repeat their stories, they repeat their analogies. The traveling sort of show pastors like have basically just 3 different sermons. If you see them more than 3 times, it seems like you've seen them all.
Yeah.
And this is like, everyone I've talked to sort of just says, yeah, I can notice this, but it's for the other people. They need everything constantly reinforced. And I haven't actually encountered anyone who is like that forgetful or that incompetent where they need this constant reinforcement. Everyone just kind of convinces themselves that it's like needed for the church community.
Yeah, I think probably just realistically, the problem is any Protestant church is just doing what they saw a previous Protestant church do. And it's like, it seemed to be working for them. Look at how long people have been attending that church. And they're not thinking about it too far. They're sort of doing what they're supposed to do. You know, like most people drive and that like, I have to go 55 here because that's the speed limit. You know, I don't think that way personally. I think about a lot of other things when I'm deciding what speed I should drive. And some people are like that, but and this is also the reason that like I haven't been attending the same church for 30 years, is because I don't think, what am I supposed to do based on some nebulous other person has decided how I'm supposed to live, and I just live that way without question. But I think most people really do just assume that they or some nebulous institution or some established system is what governs me. And so I'm starting a church because I attended a church that did it this way, and I'm just going to do it that way. So they're not really thinking about like what Jesus did, for example. So Jesus, he made 12 disciples and he taught them how to do what he did. And then he's like, now get out of here. And he left. And they were supposed to go and do the same thing, make disciples here and then send them out and then leave. And nobody's modeling like real life is not modeling its way of doing church from anything that they're seeing in the New Testament. They're modeling it based on what other Protestant churches did before. And they're not understanding that Protestantism is basically Martin Luther wanting to be the political authority figure that the Catholic Church was, but not wanting to have to submit to the existing authority. He wanted to become the new authority. And he sort of did. And then Calvin did something very similar. He became the Protestant Pope, which people call him jokingly the Protestant Pope, but he was a political figure with the authority to put to death whoever he decided he wanted to put to death, usually for religious reasons. And I think Calvin himself was personally responsible for like 70 or so executions of people, drowning them in Lake Geneva or burning them at the stake with, greenwood torches are famously mentioned because it takes longer and you suffer more. But yeah, all of this, it's like, it is not Christianity. It's not anything like New Testament Christianity. It's more like political bureaucracies that exist to perpetuate themselves and get larger.
Yeah, I think they have an appeal to the average churchgoer just because they make very little demands of you.
And they satisfy that just sort of implied idea that as Christians, we're supposed to go to church. Most people probably aren't thinking about it beyond that. Or they're not even aware that they're thinking that. They just have a subconsciously built-in urge to go to church on Sunday. They might not even be aware that they have a subconscious urge to go to church on Sunday.
Or they're just being told they have to go to church to be good people. And I don't know if anyone really thinks they're getting anything out of it.
Yeah.
Had some interesting conversations just over coffee recently with people over like, what does it mean to have like a relationship with Jesus or these things? And everyone is like very emotional about it and very, it seems tied to me with they don't really know why they're going to church, so they have to constantly be talking about these things and making it seem like this very large production to sort of hide the fact that they're not living any sort of changed lives or doing anything, but they're like investing 1/7 of their life into this.
Yeah.
Not well thought.
We have to come up with some justification. Now there are within Pentecostal churches events that do come off as strikingly supernatural, and maybe you haven't personally witnessed it, but I've been at some of these more Pentecostal leaning. And when I say the word Pentecostal, I'm thinking of something different probably than you are, because you attended a oneness Pentecostal church and I visited, and to me it looked like the lowest of the low people found a place to belong, and it was sort of like the island of misfit toys. I kept jokingly called it.
I liked a lot of them. They're very, very nice people.
But kind of crazy, There's somebody randomly dancing up and down the aisles, waving arms around, people saying just strange, a lot of people speaking in tongues and being kind of disruptive during the sermon. And like I said, it was very chaotic, a lot of very broken people. Island of misfit Pentecostals, really.
I think all the different denominations, like I view them as sort of businesses in some ways, and they cater to different markets. Catholic Church is growing as a growing resurgence, and it's pulling from, I was going to say, disaffected young men who like hierarchy. And the Catholic Church kind of offers hierarchy and encourages you to sort of, I don't know, say don't think and submit, but kind of don't think and submit.
Yeah.
While maintaining some intellectual superiority while doing so. Whereas I think Pentecostalism is appealing to people who want a little bit more emotion. It is one of the fastest growing denominations, and it's growing a lot in Latin America. Even up in Idaho, the majority of the church I was attending were, I think, I wouldn't call them misfits. I think the majority of them were just like moderately well-to-do Mexicans. Kind of they mixed with some locals who were not as well off, but they were a nice little cult. All I'll really say about them is I heard from absolutely none of them after leaving after a couple of years. So they definitely do enforce that sort of separation, which is a little cultish. But yeah, I think Pentecostals are like very emotional. They're very big on jumping up and down. The church, the pastor I was sort of under there was very much into saying that like we are very subdued compared to the Pentecostal norm. Like there's no one swinging off of chandeliers. And I don't have the experience to know if other Pentecostal churches did swing off chandeliers or if that was just sort of a rhetorical technique to kind of ground what we were doing as like a very normal.
You will see videos of Pentecostal churches like, what's that lady's name? The one that prayed for Trump. I can't think of her name. There's also like the pink-haired lady. There's the New Apostolic Reformation, which there's a whole bunch of big figures associated with that. Like Todd White, for example, is a big figure in the NAR. These kinds of events, like when they have their conferences or when they meet at their large churches, Bill Johnson's School of Supernatural Ministry, for example, they will have people making animal noises, people acting drunk, people sometimes either manifesting, they're not sure if it's the Holy Spirit or demons, but there are people who are like screaming at the top of their lungs and writhing around. They look like they're in total agony. And you'll see whoever is preaching or speaking at one of these big things going around and touching people's heads and saying, fire, the fire of God. And when they do that, then the person suddenly looks like they're on fire and they act like a person who is burning to death, like total screaming agony and writhing around on the floor. This actually, there's tons of videos of this stuff happening. So your little oneness Pentecostal church is probably thinking we're not that. That's like extreme Pentecostal in their mind. But experiences that are similar to like an acid trip or shooting up heroin or, you know, the kinds of experiences you could get easily through taking certain kinds of substances can be recreated without substances in some of these Pentecostal events. And people are genuinely experiencing these weird out-of-body moments or missing time or hallucinogenic things, going on vision, you know, passing out and going into weird lucid dream states. It's very much like doing drugs. And it's certain people, certain like the New Apostolic Reformation people, for example, seem to be better for some reason at creating these kinds of group events. And I don't know if it's like a group psychology thing that's happening or if there's genuinely some kind of supernatural creatures or, you know, some demigod or some angelic being or some fallen angel or something like that that's actually making some of these things happen. But these things are definitely happening to people at these events. And so part of the sell of the big Pentecostal movements is that there's literally these supernatural-ish type events that are very much like the experience you get from drugs.
Yeah, the sort of obviously their explanation is sort of obvious.
God's doing it.
one thing I've observed is sort of everyone in the church either enters from birth or as a broken person. So everyone is like quite moldable. I don't see, and I have never seen sort of anyone enter
An issue with the lights.
yeah, I've never seen anyone enter the church sort of as an adult without any sort of existing drug problem and sort of do all of those things. And I think going back to what I was saying about the churches in the area, one thing I will say that is very positive about that Pentecostal church or like the altar locally is, might disagree with a lot of, I think the altar's theology is like borderline demonic, but they actually do go out and find, otherwise broken people and fix them.
Yeah.
And so the reason why you go to these places and think like these people are total misfits is because they actually did go out and find people who no one else like cared about and
yeah, I have a
rehabilitated
friend,
them.
I've tried to get him to do an interview, but he started a cult successfully. So back when he was just, I don't know if he was a witch or what, he was seeking supernatural power, and he created an anagram of his name, made up the name of a deity, secretly thinking if he could get people to worship this deity, since it was an anagram of his name, they would actually be worshiping him and none of them would know about it. And he felt that he could gain power from this. So I don't know what kind of headspace he was in, but that's what he believed. And at first he was unsuccessful. A few of his friends were kind of loosely attending, but then he went out and found basically all of the homeless people and druggies and just like the most broken people. And immediately the congregation like grew into, I don't know, 60 regular attendants or whatever it was. And they were all worshiping him. And according to his story, they actually got supernatural events to occur, but to his disappointment, he couldn't control it. It was more like demons were showing up and doing things and it just became chaos. Yeah, I should try to interview that guy. It just is a phenomenon that with something like a Pentecostal church, it's really easy to just find people who have nothing that they can belong to because they don't fit in anywhere and just say, we have 0 criteria for you to belong. Come and belong.
That's sort of like a negative spin on it. The positive spin on it is like some churches won't even invite you to brunch, and these people will go and find people, and people's lives are like measurably better as a result of not like overdosing on heroin in some back alley.
Yeah, like if you can give people community, then that's a huge improvement in their life, and they probably will be less inclined to turn to drugs to numb the agony that they feel because they don't belong anywhere.
Like I think these like random churches that go and like save 5 drug addicts are doing like a lot more good in the world than like your average real life or something.
Yeah,
and you go in and obviously you're gonna see a bunch of former drug addicts who haven't really gotten the rest of their life together, but it's I think in some ways they're doing more like actual Christian work, actual trying to make disciples. They're just starting from people who like are very broken. But I think that's more in line with what Christians should be doing. They kind of stop once you're normal. I don't think they really push too far beyond that, but
yeah. Yeah, no, I'm not opposed to like your little Oneness Pentecostal church that you went to doing what they're doing. It's probably more positive than like not. But I have recently been wrestling with something like this question related to my own kids. So when I left my house to come here, my oldest daughter was playing distorted guitar really loud, version of Deftones and a Korn song, and some things that the normal Christian culture would look very far down upon. And if you grew up in a Baptist church, the idea of wearing all black clothes and learning how to play songs by Korn on an electric guitar, it would just, nobody is doing that. Literally nobody is doing that. Lizzie has a very strong faith in God, and has a tremendous amount of wisdom and virtue, but she doesn't have anything like the sort of Christian culture that you would get if you grew up in a Christian church. She's a lot more in tune with sort of mainstream culture. And I'm wondering, like, if she were to go and get her culture from real life church, and with that, she would also get the demonic teachings that come from the Protestant Reformation, which evolved from the demonic teachings that came from Catholicism, get this weird idea about God, that God like has to punish something innocent before he's able to forgive, because he's either a weird twisted kind of deity, or he's bound by some weird twisted set of laws that doesn't exist anywhere except in the theories of Protestantism. And like all of that baggage that would screw up her idea about God, would it be worth the risk of all of that baggage for her to get a culture that looks down upon playing riffs that come from the corn on electric guitar?
I think that they're forget the verse, but the "you are not of this world, this world is not your home" kind of ethos. So it's a lot easier to not play the guitar, refuse to wear pants, don't watch television, than it is to sort of be a good person.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of someone specific, but it was like, totally fine watching any sort of content on YouTube, but like, heaven forbid you have a TV in the house that turns on, like she needs to leave the building. And it's like, this doesn't really make any sense. But also I think she was an objectively terrible person. So like, this allowed her to sort of be like, oh, I am not of this world. I am very Christian. I don't have to act Christ-like because I'm not acting worldly. And the way these people pretend to be Christ-like is just to not be worldly. And it's a lot easier and also very effective for forming a nice in-group cult behavior to just sort of differentiate yourself from the world. So going back to the bureaucracy thing, like a church that makes you dress differently or act differently is going to have a lot more loyalty. Like the more sort of in-group sacrifices you make, the more loyal you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can tell them they're Christian as well because they're not worldly, and that's in their mind the same as being Christ-like.
Yeah. You'd have to be large enough to have your own sort of subculture.
You only need like 15 people.
Hmm.
Like, jocks wear their jerseys on game day or something. You don't need a lot of people to like socially signal things and like have everyone feel like they're part of a super group and be happy about themselves.
I guess technically two people could feel like they're better than everybody else, or they belong to their group of two people. Everybody does that to some extent. Yeah, you have your preferred friend that you would hang out with.
Yeah, and so I don't think there's like any relationship at all between a lot of these, like playing the guitar and your sort of moral worth or character. And I think it's just a cope because it's very easy to control access to a particular instrument or media, but it's much harder to actually live a more Christ-like life. So it's not the case. Like there's also an argument for you don't want to let in all this nonsense on TV. You don't want to let in all these ideas. You don't want this sort of poisoning your mind. And for the people who do that and also block YouTube and also block all other forms of content, I'm very, very supportive of that. But I think it's a large chunk of it is just they want to form a cohesive internal culture that is not worldly. And they define worldly as what secular America is doing, not in any sort of like sin or opposed to Christ or anything. Like worldly means whatever LA is
Wearing
doing.
black clothes, or now to be fair, if anybody dyes their hair blue, I tend to think of that person as the lowest of the low.
But that's sort of another thing where people are doing a very costly signal and when you do a costly signal, this corresponds with a lot of loyalty towards that group.
yeah, blue hair by itself didn't used to mean anything to me. It's just that blue hair has become so closely associated with like radical leftist ideas. And radical leftism seems to be just a violent rage against the notion that my actions have real consequences and I should be able to do anything that I want. Like this idea of uh, Kamala, I don't remember how to say her name correctly, thinking that abortion is one of her biggest points. Like she's running on the women's rights thing. It's like, how hard is it to just not have lots of random sex with people that would put you in a situation where you're required to have an abortion? Like, it's kind of like, just don't eat donuts every day, right? What's wrong with that? Don't have random sex with people every day such that you would need abortions. Just don't do that. Like, you have zero self-discipline. It's just irresponsible. I mean, it's expensive to get an abortion. There's health risks. And how hard would it be to just not need it? So why is that so important? And it's obvious if you look at some of the other features of the radical left that it's just hedonism with a lot of complex ideas in it that allow things like virtue signaling.
There's a lot of the ideas the left might be requiring you to believe in will change over time. When you ask how hard it is to avoid like having sex and needing abortions, I think the massive decline in like early marriages, teenage pregnancies, birth rate overall would suggest that it is actually very hard for people to do that. And I view abortion advocacy and this political movement as sort of the purpose is to sort of prevent families from forming and to encourage people to just sort of live in a more atomized, individualistic way. I think that is being done sort of maliciously to the population, but if you were someone who believed in like super individualism, it sort of makes sense that you want all of these abilities to sort of maintain your hedonism. Like it's at least logically coherent. But yeah, I think the abortion issue is surprisingly salient for a lot of like leftist women ages 15 to 50 in a way that doesn't really like make sense to me. But even granting that like all the numbers are fake and they're like getting abortions once every like year or 4 months or something, it still does not seem like, I don't really know how many of those lives were meaningfully affected by like the repeal of Roe v. Wade. I don't think the situation on the ground has materially changed, even in red states. Like Texas went from, or Oklahoma went from like one hard to access like abortion center that was 6 hours away from some people to now sort of kind of one in legal jeopardy. Like doesn't seem real. Like it just all seems like a very fake distraction. But obviously, like abortion is murder. We did not allow it.
Yeah, I recently saw an episode of South Park, speaking of not being part of Christian culture, where Cartman's mom was trying to get the law changed so that you could do an abortion once the child was 8 years old. I thought it was kind of funny. South Park, like it doesn't necessarily take any views of any political issues. It just takes what's there and makes it obvious without any apology. Like it just shows what people are actually thinking. So then you're sort of forced, it takes away all of the equivocation. It takes away all the Russell conjugations or euphemisms and just puts it out as it actually is, which I think is kind of what comedy is supposed to do. But so I feel like there were a few things that we started a thought and didn't finish it, and maybe I'll remember them, maybe I won't, I don't know. But the idea of being a Christian while being agnostic, I think is really interesting. And I intuitively know that it's problematic on some level, but like when I first started talking to you and you said something about like watching some of my videos And I described Christianity in a way that is tragically very different from how Protestantism describes Christianity. Protestantism describes Christianity as believing in like the penal substitution theory and a certain version of the Trinity, depending on which council, and probably 3 of the points of Calvinism if you're sort of light reformed, and saying that you believe those sets of essentially word salads get you access to the legal loophole that gets you into heaven on, Christ transferring his righteousness or something like that. And this is what people in Protestantism would say is the gospel. Jesus paid the penalty for your sins, and believing Jesus paid your penalty gets you into all that stuff. They've redefined Christianity as basically agreeing to a small subset of things that don't actually come from the Bible, but that can be sort of proof texted out of the Bible. Christianity, as I describe it on my channel, is how did Jesus think, feel, and live? How do we model that? How do we adopt his wisdom and his virtue? What are the things that he comprehends? And as a result of what he comprehends, how does he feel differently and act differently? And so, Christian being a little Christ, the Bible describes Christianity as walking the same steps as Christ. Real life is, the last time I checked, was quick to point out that like God never commands you to feel anything. We're going to have all kinds of different emotions. No, the Bible is very clear. Thou shalt not envy, for example. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in the heart. The Bible very clearly and specifically focuses on the importance of what you feel, because what you feel ultimately is who you are internally. And anyway, so me just describing in all of my videos that Christ-likeness is actually, you are a little Christ. You are following in the steps of Christ in what you think, feel, and do. You seemed to, at least I remember you saying at one point, if that's what Christianity is, then I'm fine with being a Christian. And whether or not you believe in God really is kind of irrelevant. If you're going to decide to model your life after the teachings or example of Christ.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a YouTuber called Alex O'Connor who...
You have coffee in there, right?
Yeah, I might get coffee in there.
Hey, will you just grab a cup for both of us? Thank you. See, this is an example of Christ-like behavior. Just because I asked, he's getting me my coffee. He's not making me get my own. Maybe one of the things that I do pick up from Christian culture is an obsession with coffee. Well, no, I didn't pick it up from Christian culture. I actually got it in a completely different way, but I share that in common with Christian culture because for some reason, like every mega church also has like a coffee shop. It might be like something that mega churches are doing right. This is obviously up for debate, but like to have a coffee shop in a mega church, I think causes people to have more interaction, more fellowship.
Yeah, and I will actually will say that there are churches, some of the crazier Pentecostal ones, that will give their guests free coffee, free espresso. So I will say they're doing it more right than in real life. But
because they charge.
Yeah, I think Alex Connor for like one of those. He used to go by like cosmic skeptic, but he had this phrase where he was like a non-resistance non-believer. It's probably where I kind of started. Not, I would say, resistant to the idea of belief, just like it didn't make sense on sort of an emotional level. I don't find like the Kalan cosmological argument or any of these first cause logical things just convincing. We'll just say that.
Like the ontological argument is complete silliness. It's just utterly laughably silly.
I mean, some people like it, and I'll grant it's like moderately convincing, but it just doesn't.
Not enough that you're willing to die for it.
Yeah, it doesn't really. it's not clear to me just because it makes sense that it is true. It is not clear to me that
It sort of rhetorically makes sense, but it's just a word trick, the ontological argument.
and I would say that none of the sort of arguments for theism more broadly really do any significant logical work towards a specific deity or religion.
Yeah.
And that sort of extra jump is always a little unclear.
The ontological argument. Therefore, you should be a Mormon. It doesn't work.
Yeah. That said, I sort of always had kind of an interest in children, politics, the future, planning, and the question of how should society arrange itself is kind of coming up frequently. And one of the things I sort of like about Christianity, from a practical perspective, is it sort of answers the question of how should people be acting if they're going to be interacting for in eternity, and that is, for all intents and purposes, a very, very good model for how to interact with people for a couple generations. And then everyone always sort of asks, like, what is your relationship with Jesus? And I never quite understand what people mean by this, because when I ask them to define it, they always give very unclear answers. I would say that I kind of do the standard Christian thing of praying occasionally. And periodically, things happen where it's like, is this an answered prayer? To give an example, I recently decided to become a cheese manufacturer for reasons. And I was like, all right. And then I talked to someone at the sort of AI meetup that I go to. We just kind of discuss AI, robots, that sort of things. That's sort of my actual field. And the guy was like, you should make mozzarella and just bring it in and I'll buy some from you. I'm like, cool. And I was like, all right, what do I need? And there's, you need rennet, which is sort of a little additive to the milk as you're boiling it. And it's part of the cheese making process. So I went to a cheese store and I was like, I need rennet because I kind of want to become a cheese manufacturer. And they just looked at it and they're like, we buy local cheese. It'd be really cool if you sold mozzarella to us because that's what we're looking for. And I was like, that's actually what I'm looking to make. And obviously there's a host of regulatory hurdles you have to go through before you can start selling raw dairy products to a store. I can't just do that from my kitchen. But I was like, oh, maybe this is like God validating that I should go down this path. And then you talk to other people like Rich here, and he's like, well, that actually check out as a business. And so,
You told me to offer objections.
Yeah.
So
Objections
I tried to give you secular wisdom.
Yeah. I think there's, pros and cons. And there's a variety of, if I were to put like max, I feel like I answer the question of what is your relationship with God in the perspective of like, what is the other person asking? So if a Pentecostal asks like, what is your relationship with God? They want to know like, how frequently you speak in tongues and are you running around? And so I could say like, oh, I pray and occasionally I bump into people in a way that feels sort of supernatural, but that's not what they're asking. So I just say like, no, because I don't speak in tongues, for instance.
So you don't really have a relationship with God in the eyes of the Oneness Pentecostal Church.
Right. And I don't ever fully understand what people are asking when the average person says that. And there was a guy who actually bumped into him at a coffee shop, really, really nice fellow, invited me over to his house for dinner, and we chatted for hours, really liked him. Hopefully he comes to my Christmas party. And he said the difference between just sort of praying and waiting for things and having a relationship is not caring what the other person means when they ask that question and just asserting that whatever you're doing is the relationship with God. So the next time someone asks me, I'll be like, of course I have a relationship with God because I pray and occasionally things happen. And that's how God speaks to me. And I don't think that would convince any individual in a secular society. And I kind of weight everything I'm saying based on like, is this actually reasonable? Is this something other people care about? And
I used to go to a big Calvary chapel in Boise, and I found it hilarious that like there was a bunch of people with skateboards like on church property, and they were setting up ramps and stuff. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? Well, this is our skating ministry. And like one guy had a snowboarding ministry, and somebody had like a mountain biking ministry. And by attaching the word ministry to it, now it's like, this is my relationship with God. I go out snowboarding.
Yeah, like that seems very just silly to me.
But then you get church endorsement, and you get sort of social credit at the church because what you're doing is actually a ministry. And, to be honest, you were going to be doing it anyway, regardless of the church. But now you also get sort of the benefits of Calvary Chapel's endorsement, which there's tons of networking benefits. The fact that you could now do it on church property. And if you wanted to go to the school for some reason, or you wanted to, well, just all of the benefits of group identity.
Yeah. Broadly, I think that a lot of sort of, let's say my image of Christianity was shaped mostly by Christians or self-professed Christians. And it wasn't particularly positive. Christians are kind of not, I guess with Trump, there may be a more relevant subculture, but they're not particularly influential. They don't really matter. I was always sort of living in large blue cities. And so it's sort of, these are strange people with somewhat strange views. I don't really know what they do. And then you look into it a little bit and things just seem sort of strange. Or just immediately, like it seemed like they were believing impossible things for the sake of being part of a group. Most of a statement of faith, even at real life or anything, they're not things that you could ask someone to describe. You can't, like, you always use the, what does it mean to be a measurable thing? But it's like having someone say like, it is absolutely critical that you believe this. And then you ask, what is that? And they just go like, I don't know. Like people can't, I've never heard a coherent explanation of the Trinity. And then looking at sort of the oneness Pentecostals, they're technically modalists in terms of their Trinitarian heresy. So they believe that, God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit are one, but actually one. Whereas the Trinity is, they're one, but they're also not one.
I think I find it kind of hilarious that the oneness Pentecostal churches have a document that people are required to agree to for membership, which explicitly says that everyone who attends real life church is going to go to hell. And real life church has the same thing, a document that explicitly states that everybody who is part of the oneness Pentecostals is also going to go to hell. But if like these people were to meet at a coffee shop and do a Bible study, yeah, you're a Christian brother, but it's like, doesn't it like bother you a little bit?
I would say the smaller the denomination, the stronger the in-group feeling, and the more they will be in combat. So
like a oneness Pentecostal
is more likely to say something controversial or confrontational in a coffee shop.
Yeah,
which is to their credit, I think. Like it's that
they have more conviction.
Was it Christopher? It might have been Christopher Hitchens or someone who said like, I don't believe in Christian love because they're not willing to have like an uncomfortable conversation. Like if they think I'm going to hell, why are they not trying their best to convert me?
Yeah.
Like, do you really have Christ-like love for your fellow man if you're stopped and you're not constantly trying to make the world a better place? That's sort of cynical, and you don't really have time for that in practice.
Well, there's a really easy out, which is part of Protestantism. Protestantism, and especially Calvinism, has supplied us, and to be fair, it actually came from Augustine, has supplied us with an easy out, and that is, I give God all the glory. And if you change the word slightly, it's easy to go from I give God all the glory to if it didn't happen, it was because God didn't do it, which is basically, if I failed, it's not my fault. So I give God the glory is sort of a pious way of saying that anything bad that happens is not actually my fault. because it had to have been God that changed that person's heart or something like that.
It's like you give God the credit because he is the one who rains on the seeds, but there's still someone who planted and tilled the soil, to butcher that analogy. And I think there is an obligation there to be, Peter working the soil. A lot of them do just kind of have a cop out there.
Yeah.
There is the Great Commission where you're supposed to go out there and just make disciples of all the nations. And it doesn't feel like people are doing it. And
there's even, there's a commandment in the laws of Moses. It says, if you see your neighbor violating any of the laws, transgressing against God, transgressing against their neighbors, this is presumed to be bad because the laws actually prevent like diseases and total breakdown of civil society. So law is good because law makes it possible for us to like not die of weird diseases and also maintain peace with one another. And if we're stealing our neighbor's stuff or we're having sex with their animals, then you're going to get diseases and war and whatever. So the law, I can't remember the exact reference, but if you see your neighbor violating any of the laws, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall love your brother and point out to him where he is transgressing against the law. So like if you don't address a person's error, it's described as hating them in your heart. And it is specifically commanded that you don't let a violation just go. You have to bring it up. You have to confront your neighbor. And then there's something similar where I think it's Paul, if you see your brother in sin, then examining yourself first, the one who is spiritual should go to your brother who is in error and save his soul by correcting him, pointing out his error, showing him how to get out of that error, saving his soul, and also covering a multitude of sins.
Yeah, there's the I guess there's the anti-Protestant angle there, where despite the fact that your brother was believing the same thing the entire time, his actions were what was determining his salvation in that case. So you could save his soul by correcting his actions. But going back to the
it's actually something like this that has motivated me to create my YouTube channel.
Yeah, there's this tension between, everyone kind of knows what the Great Commission is, or at least that Christians should be prophesying outside of the church, and everyone kind of knows that you're supposed to be out there teaching people and like doing good things, and then you just don't see that in your average Christian. To answer your original question, and this, I have a very low tolerance for this sort of hypocrisy, or if Christians actually believed everything they said they would believe, they would act more Christ-like. They don't. So I don't give them the charity that they actually believe what they say they're believing.
Yeah.
If it is an organization that is set up with certain tax privileges and is collecting money from people and looks like, a bureaucracy trying to do its own thing, and then no one actually practices what they preach, then I'm just going to assume the actual purpose of the organization is to extract that money, because what other purpose could they have? The idea that they actually believe they're going to get eternal life for being good people, but then they're not good people.
Well, they don't. They
would suggest they're like really dumb.
Yeah, like your Protestant churches, they don't believe that they're going to get eternal life by being good people. In fact, they will specifically say, we don't believe you get saved by being a good person, because they believe in some version of total depravity and imputed righteousness. They believe that you go to heaven by believing Jesus paid your penalty or imputed your righteousness or absorbed the wrath of God, or some version of the Protestant atonement theory that became popular.
Yeah, I think, what brought sort of me back to, not back, but towards Christianity, but broadly traditional culture, traditional values, is just sort of kind of looking around the world and thinking like, is this particular worldview that is guiding most of the world like having good fruits? And so when you look to Christianity, you're kind of looking for a different worldview and producing sort of different fruits. Cheesy little architectural example that I saw on Twitter, right? You see like Notre Dame, you see all these great cathedrals, and then you see like modern architecture, and it's like, clearly one of these is like more beautiful. It is like better for the soul. Like I want to be living and surrounded by people who think it is worth building things like this, and not like some crappy modern city or brutalist architecture or whatever it is we're talking about.
Yeah, the person who like designed and built a trailer house is obviously a very different kind of person than the person who built Notre Dame. There's something just profoundly different between those two people.
There's always an issue of like economic class and stuff, but like maybe because I didn't understand abstract art as a kid or whatever it was, but you can see a lot of beauty that came out of this sort of, I'll just call it Christendom, Western Europe, while it was very Christian. And it seemed like it was a nice time all around. And sort of what drew me back to exploring the church was like, all right, are these people who are just like, if we give them some money, they're going to like start building this stuff, and they're just, I don't know, being repressed by modernity or something. And I found, to my dismay, this whole like total depravity is just sort of an excuse to like not do anything politically. I despise rapture people.
It's also an excuse not to do anything.
Yeah, they're all just lazy. And you know, any church that preaches the rapture is kind of implicitly content with just maintaining their little church and waiting for the end of the world. Mm-hmm. And you know, I look at pastors who teach that, and I go like, oh, you just don't want a job. You just like are collecting tithe money from these people and like have no ambition. And there's like this opportunity cost of like, if the average churchgoer probably genuinely believes in like whatever values you're preaching, and you're actively siphoning away time, resources, and organizing energy. So I just don't like a lot of these churches, but I definitely do believe that living a more Christ-like life is good for you and good for society. I think the older I get, or the more history I learn, or the more random statistics I learn, the more all of the laws start making sense. I remember as a kid, the Levitical don't wear different types of cloth was just one of those like, look at those Christians, they're wearing polyester and they're breaking the commandments. They're all just hypocrites or some nonsense. And well, now I just don't wear plastic. I absolutely refuse to wear anything that isn't like 100% cotton, 100% linen.
There's actually like the law of selling two different kinds of cloth together. And I don't think that it was like that person's going to burn in hell, because I don't know that God was like super weirded out by different types of cloth. It might have been more just a practical thing. A lot of people were really dumb.
But it's one of those things where like it seems really, really stupid. Mm-hmm. And maybe the intent is not to say no synthetic fibers, but I do genuinely believe there's a lot of wisdom in not having synthetic fibers. And it's kind of,
well, if you think about the kinds of cloth they might have had back then. They might have had some kind of material made from fibers from plants, so something like cotton, or other types of plant fibers that could be put together. You would have leather, of course. You'd have different types of leather. But like if you were to make a garment and sew cotton to leather and then like try to wear it over a long period of time, it's going to do weird stuff. It's going to bunch weird. It's going to tear, and it's probably just impractical. There's some argument that certain Hebrew laws were for distinguishing them from the rest of the world. And so there may be some merit to that idea. Like, don't shave the corners of your beard. Seems weird, but like maybe that just identified them as being God's people. So you could always spot the Jew in the crowd or something like that. Maybe.
Yeah, I think there's kind of the law does, I think, have certain things that are just for that purpose. Sort of my reading of the Old Testament. And yeah, I guess these laws could have different meanings, but none of them seem as silly as they used to. I guess on all social issues, the slippery slope is just true. the idea that it's a fallacy has been like thoroughly debunked empirically. If you don't want to be going down this slippery slope of social change, like you kind of have to follow biblical law. Doesn't seem to be another way to do it.
If you are in a very blue state or a city that's very blue, maybe the easy argument against conservative values is to just laugh at them and talk about how silly they are and bring up some law that you don't understand, like, oh, you have to shave the corners, or you can't shave the corners of your beard if you're a Christian. Oh, this is dumb. Or like, you could point to, there was a person who was put to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath, and you say, oh, God is completely irrational, and thing like that. And to just dismiss it immediately and then dismiss everything that's associated with it immediately so that you can go out and have abortions as much as you want and sleep with anything that moves. It seems to be what's going on there.
I mean, there is, to steal man that argument, though, there is a certain amount of, if you are going to claim like omniscience, benevolence, perfection, you are setting yourself up for like one counterexample. So this is sort of like God is not, omniscient and omnipotent and benevolent if you kind of like got killed for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. That argument like makes, I think, a lot more sense to me. Or I can see why one would just make that argument. Because they're not necessarily pushing back on the idea that most of the Bible has like good rules for living. I think anyone can sort of acknowledge in a purely secular way that any collection of rules for society that has lasted for a long time, if nothing else, it is a rule set that if followed, your society will last a long time.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to maximal human flourishing and happiness and all these modern virtues, but for most of human history, survival was the key metric, and people who followed these rules like have survived. And so the Bible sort of stands already as like useful in that regard. And I think they're pushing back on the like divine authorship and the sort of
some of the other claims.
It's like an accusation of maybe it's survivorship bias, and it's just brought along a bunch of spandrel beliefs. So I've heard that and said similar things in the past.
I think it's very, I don't know, it's interesting when I encounter someone who like hates Christianity, and there are people who like hate Christianity, to just put to them, okay, Christianity by definition is to follow the example of Christ, and he essentially taught love your neighbor. So like, what part of love your neighbor do you think is like really bad? And I'm not bound by kind of what's going on in the mind of the Protestant, that we have to convince people to believe in the Nicene Council's version of inspiration, or whatever. Every word of Scripture is written directly by the Holy Spirit, and you have to believe that, and you have to believe in this version of the Trinity, and you have to believe in this version of atonement. I actually believe that Christianity, or even your judgment on the day of judgment, is going to be a measure of your Christ likeness, not on whether or not you like signed some statement of faith or believed in some atonement theory. So I wholeheartedly reject as demonic the 5 solas and that kind of stuff. So when I do evangelism, I'm actually wanting people to learn about Christ, his virtues, his ethics, his wisdom, and be sold on the idea of modeling their life after that. And in a sense, like, believing in God is kind of secondary. Believing in the inspiration of Scripture is kind of secondary to that. Believing that, like, even like the book of Ephesians is actually written by a person who is, in every word, is endorsed by God himself, because the Apostle Paul, met Christ. I don't really care necessarily. Like, if there are parts of Ephesians that seem weird and don't make sense, well, then don't worry about it.
I think there's the that classic, like, if God wasn't watching, what would you be doing? Or any accusation towards the sort of agnostic atheist sphere of like, you must be immoral because you are not Christian. I think all the people who make those arguments are betraying like a complete lack of like they are not Christ-like. Because I've even had people admit this, where like, oh yeah, if God wasn't watching, I'd be doing all sorts of crazy things. And it's like those things are still probably bad for you, or bad for other people, or bad for society.
I've actually encountered even like elders at churches who they don't even think that way. Like the one guy who was sort of responsible for the last major church that I got my whole family kicked out of was like, I don't ever even think about whether or not my actions are pleasing to God, because I know that in the sight of God, I'm righteous because he looks at me and he sees the righteousness of Christ. So like whether or not what he's doing is virtuous in the eyes of God was not even a metric that he uses to navigate any portion of his life. And this guy's an elder at one of the big churches here. And to me, that's just appalling, but this is what Reformed theology really does if you both think and accept Reformed theology. Granted, there's a lot of Christians who accept Reformed theology, but they don't think. So they just kind of live, I know I'm supposed to like try to be a good person, and they don't really go beyond that, you know?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. My experience with most Christians is they do believe they're supposed to be good people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if they could articulate why, but I'm sure if you asked them why, they would say something like Jesus said, love your neighbor. Like they're not going to start quoting Calvin or something because they just don't necessarily follow all of that.
Yeah. If you go to a Calvinist church, which you haven't been to a Calvinist church, so.
But we would keep talking about real life. Is real life not a Calvinist church?
They're not like a Southern Baptist Calvinist church, like a Southern Baptist style church, or a church that is openly Calvinist. They are huge. Like theology is really, really important to them. So the congregation is going to be able to like quote portions of the Westminster Confession. Like literally, they're going to do this. They're going to all know like what are the 5 points. So probably have 10% of the congregation will be able to accurately describe the 5 points to you. Definitely more into the theology and kind of to gain access to the group identity of like a Southern Baptist church that's strongly Calvinist. You need to be more familiar with these theologies and be able to articulate them. And so it's.
I'm very confident I could walk in, say I'm going to start tithing money, and they would not care. As long as I didn't ask any questions and just sat in the back.
Depending on who they is, yes, like the church would welcome you, but like you're not going to get invited to cigars and whiskey to have the after discussions with the other Calvinists. Like Calvinists really are very big on cigars and hard liquor and theological discussion. I think it's because
Catholics actually do the same thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Catholics have like young Catholics especially seem to, at least locally in Post Falls, have brought back this whole cigar trend. I don't know exactly why. I'm like,
Jesus probably smokes cigars.
I think it's also just kind of a pro nicotine kind of view as well.
You have a pro nicotine view?
I don't, but I'm sympathetic to the argument that the government doesn't really tend to ban anything that's actually bad for you. Like they don't stop the microplastics in the water. They don't like stop these forever chemicals. They don't like give you healthy food. They don't give you healthy medicine.
Yeah, I don't think you can broad brush that though.
And suddenly, the way at which they don't like smoking, I don't know if that's I'm not convinced by this, but I am adjacent to that in enough ways to be like emotionally sympathetic to the idea that like maybe nicotine is okay just because the government doesn't like it. You can't do that for everything, and I'm not going to like smoke cigarettes, and I'm not going to let my kids smoke cigarettes, but I'm not going to yell at all the people who are like doing nicotine patches. Tucker Carlson, for instance, has like a
tobacco
thing where he talks about like,
yeah.
I don't do tobacco, but I do nicotine, and alludes to some of the things I'm saying. So it's sort of.
He does, yeah, he's got advertisements in the middle of his show for some chewing tobacco, which I thought was weird. Like, I don't think that chewing tobacco is actually good for your health, but I didn't personally do the research, so I can't say.
Yeah.
And the fact that the government is opposed to it is highly suspicious.
I mean, chemicals are probably. I mean, I'm like a caffeine addict, so like I can't really like morally judge someone for like being moderately addicted to a different chemical.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I haven't really encountered these Calvinists. It would be kind of strange. I don't really see the appeal of sitting around discussing theology, um, especially when your theology is so weak in terms of they don't want to do anything. Like if you believe the 5 points of Calvinism, or I don't know if they're associated with like rapid theology, but I'm just gonna lump these people together. You're not doing anything, and that strikes me as just like impotent and useless. Like I would much rather discuss with some friends, like, oh, we're all gonna like run for office, or we're all going to build our businesses so we like have money or a future or something, and there's some sort of building going on. Whereas a lot of this like circle jerk theology just seems kind of useless. And I don't really know what they do after the first couple sessions. Like what do you talk about? Like I can continuously meet with someone and give updates on how my cheese business is going, right? Here's the progress on my permits. Here's a vendor I found to get wholesale milk. Like here's all these things. And it's like it's only interesting because it's like new. There's some update. Which kind of goes to like church kind of repeats itself anyways. Like, it seems very boring. People do it.
I know at least in part, like there are several motivations for what Calvinists do. Anybody have any interesting comments?
I don't know. Are we supposed to look at the comments?
It's difficult because the computer's far away. But yeah, sorry if we're not addressing comments to the people who are in the live chat. It's difficult for us to read it and put the camera where it sees both of us. I'll probably go through and address all the comments later on. But you know, I interviewed a lady who her whole reason for becoming a Calvinist, and she was pretty plain about this. She really sucked at evangelism, and Calvinism told her that the people that wouldn't listen to her just weren't chosen. And so it alleviated that sense of I've failed, right? And of course, I proposed to her she probably just sucks at evangelism, and maybe she should learn how to do it better. But
absolutely,
it's not exactly God's fault, you know, that kind of thing. And this is also why total depravity appealed to Augustine, apparently, and it's part of what appeals to a lot of people. So, you know, like you pointed out, Calvinism is very weak. Like you really have to go out of your way to pull things out of context and twist them and really just unapologetically use the Bible to prove text dumb ideas in order to make Calvinism seem like it's anything other than what you called circle jerk theology. That's
well, you can also have totally biblically sound theology that's a little circle jerky. It's just Calvinism doesn't lend itself to ever doing anything. Like you're not going to discuss like your progress on becoming a better evangelizer.
But you know the whole Harry Potter, I'm the chosen one thing. Being the chosen one, and in Calvinism, like they put this huge emphasis on the you part, like the you in tulip, which is unconditional election. And I think the reason is because I'm chosen because of some divine mystery. And it's like, well, why does God like you and not this other person? It's the divine mystery. Like that almost makes it seem more special and more interesting. And
I see that appealing to a certain type of person.
It does. It appeals to a certain type of person. It can also potentially cause a certain type of person or certain people to become more like that. And if you meet these kinds of people who are Calvinists because they like the idea that they're chosen and you're not, these are kind of like the epitome of the arrogant, annoying, I want to punch them in the face kinds of Calvinists. And these are also the people who are more likely to sit around in these groups and keep reminding themselves and sort of stirring up this idea that Calvinism really is the best system of theology. And the criteria for being chosen is how strongly you believe in Calvinism, which is this weird kind of self-sustaining parasite idea. There's got to be a name for that, like an idea that believing the idea like is the criteria for all the benefits that you get from believing the idea. And so it's this weird circular thing that maintains and protects itself.
I mean, any system can like self-reinforce. I'm not sure if there's a name for it, but like it makes sense. There's a loop, right? Like,
yeah. So basically, they're just
I go to a job because I think I get paid, and they pay me, so I stay.
They have to keep doing this whiskey and cigars and theology thing to keep reminding themselves that they're the chosen one and keep reinforcing this good feeling they have about themselves being more special than you who are not chosen. So that's kind of why they do it. So, and who is it? Our friend, I don't know if he's really a friend, this guy that we know, Dan, who pointed out to me that chosen one syndrome.
I like Dan.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get more coffee. You want coffee?
Yeah. Part of Hebrew culture, you have to imagine what it felt like for like the early Hebrew people to be chosen by Jehovah, like the God of God, and like our God is bigger than all of your gods, you Egyptian people, that kind of thing. It's going to happen that certain people are going to just feel like they're more special than you. And I remember when I was at Moody, for example, I'd see somebody who I knew from their personal story that they were hurting, and maybe they'd been rejected by their family, or maybe they were going to have to leave the school because they were running out of finances and they had no place to go. And they're basically at a very tragic point in their lives. And like my heart would go out to these people. I actually gave like huge sums of money to some of these people at certain points because like I just couldn't bear to see that's happened to this person or whatever. But I would see them walk past the chosen one syndrome Calvinists, and they were completely invisible to those people. So it really does produce people who are just oblivious to Christ-like features, you know, Jesus being compassionate and kind and considerate and selfless. And Calvinism does not produce those characteristics.
Yeah, I kind of I'm sure your audience is familiar. You talk a lot about Calvinists. I don't think they produce a lot of good fruit, and I'm not like historically aware of like I don't see a way to go from this idea of elect people to like the society I want to live in. So I just kind of a priori reject their entire belief system. And kind of one of the appeals of Christianity is it kind of logically, like anyone can sort of sit down and think like, how roughly should people be behaving to have like a good life and a nice society? And you might get some things wrong because you lack certain knowledge or discernment, but kind of the Bible aligns with my sort of logical, how should we be behaving more often than not, if not most of the time. And at least when I started. Now I think I'm basically in full agreement, but the Calvinists just don't. So I think unless you grow up in that world and you like grant them a lot of authority or you respect them before, it's just sort of like, these are silly people. They have their beliefs. Like, why would I choose to become a Calvinist? It doesn't seem like I have good fruit. Like,
Calvinists are mostly people who have been converted from a lesser form of Calvinism in some Protestant Christian circle, like real life. Maybe a couple of the associate pastors are Calvinist, but the head pastor, Jim Putman, he, and I quote, absolutely hates Calvinism and what it does to people. And he can't stand the fact that it's even happening in his church with some of the elders and some of the associate pastors pushing Calvinism, and he's like fighting against it. And he was kind of stymied, didn't know what to do about this phenomenon. And of course, the problem is he doesn't realize it, but his theology is foundationally Calvinist because he believes in total depravity and he believes in penal substitution, which logically follows from total depravity. And if you're going to be a thinking person and believe those two things, Calvinism follows from that. So he'll never wipe out Calvinism in his church until he gets rid of the logical foundation for it from his own system of ideas.
My ego is too large to accept total depravity. I'm sure that someone could cast that as sort of pride, but it's like, it doesn't make sense to me that you can't live a sinless life, and that everyone is just sort of condemned to like being totally depraved. I don't have like this secret compulsion all the time to like rob people or murder people or
Even when you were living in a blue state and had no knowledge of God? Or...
Yeah, and I think broadly liberals aren't like less moral. Sure, there's some study that says they're more moral, but probably suspect data. Random well-off college students maybe are more generous than the average person. That doesn't really say anything.
Yeah, I just look around you, and anecdotally, it might have been Luther, one of the people who was a foundational thinker in what has now become Calvinism, said something like, I think it was Luther, we are, as Christians, just like only completely wicked. Like every one of us is just in heart like a rampant murderer, and other words that you can't see on YouTube, and he literally used these words. And the only thing that changes for the Christian is that we become covered in the righteousness of Christ. And so in his mind, everybody was as wicked internally as apparently he experienced himself to be.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confessing going around when people are sort of saying these sort of total depravity things. And I think there is the possibility, I would just say, like for moral growth, there might be some action, like maybe you don't think stealing is wrong or something. I don't think the goal of a Christian is to not steal. The goal of the Christian is to understand that stealing is wrong, maybe because like you love your neighbor and so you realize you don't want to steal the stuff, or you're empathizing.
Just understand that like civil society is impossible if there is nothing like right to property, right?
Yeah.
If I can just go up to any person's house and take their car and drive away in it, how is that person going to get to work in the morning? There has to be some level of consistency, the connection between me and the stuff that I have power over that you don't have power over. Otherwise, it's just weird.
Yeah, I think you can develop this sort of gut level aversion to sinning for all sins. And I think, different people struggle with different ones, but, there's a lot of sins out there that like you or I just like wouldn't do.
Yeah, like arson. I've never actually struggled with arson as a temptation. I could just have it. It doesn't ever even occur to me. Like, man, I want to burn down this building. But maybe it does for some people.
Yeah, I mean, it depends who's in the building. But like, it's I guess that's just murder. But it, like right off the bat, there seems to be kind of an argument from induction. I sort of understand how someone could stop sinning with one sin by having a changed mind. They were sinning all the time. I understand the 0 to 1 case, and I understand the n to n plus 1, and so it is not obvious to me that you couldn't complete that process.
Yeah.
And people just kind of assert a priori like everyone is going to sin, or they just look at you like, oh, you think you're like better than the rest of us? And it's like, yes. And that's obviously my sin. It's like I need to develop like an aversion to pride. But
it's also it's self-contradictory if you're trying to evangelize somebody and they're like, you think you're better than us? And if you say, no, I'm a depraved sinner, it's like, well, then why would I want to be like you? Like, what do you sound like exactly? You say, yes, I am better than you, and you should be more like me because I'm more virtuous and I have more wisdom.
I think, yeah, I guess I've become more comfortable with hierarchy in general as I've aged. There are people in our lives that
I've heard you mention noblesse oblige or whatever.
I'm not going to go that far. I think it's I'm not a noble, but I think there is a lack in society of people who just care for people. So a lot of these super libertine values, like rates of abortion, are really low amongst, elite married couples. Rates of divorce are really low among anyone making over 400,000, right? It's, these dual income families, that are making oodles of money, living very nicely. Their kids aren't like doing crack. They would never think of this. They're arguing for like drug legalization, and there's sort of this. It's kind of like, we can resist these temptations. Why should we put anyone in jail? And it's this kind of reverse noblesse oblige. Back in the day, the nobles would be like, "Oh yeah, we're living good lives, but peasants need to be protected." And I'm not saying we need to go necessarily full back there, but I think there's a lot of like good intentions in giving people these opportunities for like sin and ruining their lives. But
to be realistic, we have, what is it, Heritage Hillside Church is what we're calling our church.
heritagehillside.com.
Yeah, you should definitely attend. It's not possible to attend for most people, but
yeah, I don't think there's any value in virtual streaming a service, because there's like no community, there's no fellowship, there's no breaking of bread. Like, what is the point of that?
Yeah, but what actually happens, and what I'm an advocate of, for a time I could not pay my mortgage because of a transition between my previous 6-figure software job and the 6-figure software job that came after that. And my friend here actually helped me to pay my mortgage at one point. And this is what we're supposed to do as a community. And you see this just spelled out in the book of Acts. And they went a little bit further in that everybody brought the resources and let the people who were sort of responsible in the church manage the resources, so that the one who had extra had nothing left over, and the one who had too little had no lack. So it's not as extreme as what they did in the Bible, but Eric here, his water heater failed, and I had 15 years experience in plumbing, so I came and I helped him to fix his water heater, something that he wouldn't have easily been able to do by himself. So we, as believers, help each other out. And the secular world does this also, but the Christian world is supposed to be better at that. And so our little micro church, we help each other like this. I reached out to a guy who attends our church when I had a software project that required like full stack development, and I do more geometry stuff. And so here's an opportunity for you to help me with a project. And he jumped on board, that kind of stuff.
I think, going back to that, I think we are just better than like the world at this, right? Like that water heater was replaced for substantially less than what you could do in the world. Like we have less inefficiency in our little market, so to speak. And we have like more resources now collectively, because we are not
just one person.
And we are kind of, I'm a huge fan in general of communities that are kind of building up their local economies, buy local, go to your local farmers market, all of this jazz. But I also think that is like good for people. I think you're creating a strong local community that's going to allow for strong families, which is going to allow for moral children and more Christ-like behavior going forward. But even on a scale of like a little home church, you can already see like there's material economic benefits to just prioritizing that. And I think that's, it's like an obvious fruit that this perspective on Christianity is sort of correct, because you kind of see, a Calvinist act and doesn't like donate money to someone walking across the street. And now every time Rich tells this story, you just go like, oh yeah, that's what Calvinists do. And hopefully like you'll retell this story of like nice Christian behavior. Like people who aspire to be more Christ-like are living lives that are like you would want to be a part of it. And part of that is because of that Christ-like community. And, where I think I made the website for Heritage Hillside, and all the imagery is just like little cities on a hill. And I think part of that is kind of like, in some ways, that whole unconditionally elect is like this weird demonic shadow of it. We want a community where everyone looks at it and goes, oh, like I would like to live like those people. What do they have different? and they're almost supposed to ask, like, how do we become a part of this community? How do we become more? They learn that it's because we're more Christ-like.
Yeah, Christianity is supposed to be attractive in some way, because Christ likeness is supposed to be like a preferable model for how you live. So,
yeah.
And if you break it down, Christianity really is about wisdom and virtue. Wisdom, another word for that is like competence, right? And virtue is filled with everything that is theoretically desirable in terms of character. So, like self-discipline is a virtue. Eating boxes of donuts every day is kind of the opposite of virtue. Right?
Well, I'm the largest that any pastor should be. If you,
Yeah. Well, can you still get into skinny jeans? It's a huge criteria for being a pastor. Just being able to look good in skinny jeans.
I don't think I look good in skinny jeans. I don't think I can get in skinny jeans. So.
It's time for you to get some more virtue.
Yeah, it probably is.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask if you had any other questions.
I was curious about Sam Bankman-Fried, just because I watched Joe Rogan, right? Which, as a person who is part of Christian culture, I cannot endorse Joe Rogan because he uses the F word frequently. But I watch Joe Rogan all the time. And Russell Brand and Benny Johnson, and some of these people who are kind of the emerging media that is not the propaganda machine of the mainstream media. And everybody knows these names, kind of Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, and Joe Rogan, whatever. But they bring up Sam Bankman-Fried quite a bit. And I also, a lot of my friends, and in fact, my current employer was one of the early Bitcoin evangelists, and he's invested lots of money in Ethereum and different things. So, and then of course the AI group that we both have attended off and on, they talk about AI, and there's something about the people who are interested in AI and robotics and those kinds of things also tend to be interested in the algorithms, at the very least, behind things like cryptocurrencies. And so what happened with Sam Bankman-Fried is also kind of interesting to me. And I'm sure it relates to questions of ethics and things like that. And the fact that you went to college with him and you guys were friends for a long time, I thought you might have something.
Yeah. I met Sam after we graduated. He graduated MIT in 2014, in 2015. And he was working as a trader at Jane Street. And
What does that mean?
Jane Street is a it's a proprietary shop, so it has a bunch of rich people who own it, and then they just make money with money. It's usury on steroids.
So it's just an exchange for the stocks.
You can't put your money in. They're just making money from their money. It's not exclusively high frequency, which I think is literally just robbing people, but they're not adding any value to society. They're just making money.
So it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Effectively, like all teachers' pension funds have slightly less money in them because they make a lot of money. But very nice people. There was a really nice guy. I think his name, I think I've met them through, anyways. I met a bunch of Jane Street people through kind of some mutual friends, just boozy brunch in New York, a lot of fun. And we kind of started this like weekly game night karaoke thing. It was a lot of fun. If you want me to say, Sam was a little shy. I feel like I helped Sam out of his shell, but not to like say he was not at all a bad person. I definitely had some problems at that time. A bad relationship, a few other things, and he was giving me a lot of really good advice, and a lot of like good support at the time I needed it. So he was a good guy. Mm-hmm. I ended up going out to Oregon. He ended up going to the Bay Area, and he got into this like ethical altruism idea. He was kind of in that before, but it was this sort of idea that you should approach being good quantitatively. I think I'm sort of biased as an engineer, same sort of logical thinking. There's a really good book called Totally blanking. Maybe that's divine.
What
Maybe
was
it's
it
not a good
about?
book. It was about a series of, like, every time you do charity out in the world, you kind of have an implied control group. Like if you give money to some random African village, you can find a different African village with the exact same demographic characteristics that did not get your money, and you can just sort of compare. So like a lot of interesting tidbits come out of this. Like if you want to reduce the rate of malaria,
But that would be more of like a qualitative assessment, though, right? Was this charitable action effective? We can compare the one who received the charitable action to the one who did not, right?
yes, I guess that's the qualitative one. You can also make it quantitative by like, what is the price of a bed net that reduces malaria? From, I guess the qualitative is 0 to charging for it. But it turns out the more you charge for the bed net up until a certain point, the more likely someone is to use it. So if you want to like save someone from malaria, you don't give them the bed net. You actually like make them pay with everything they have. And this is like going to save more people. And it's sort of this like odd and counterintuitive, but like, yeah, if you want to like save more lives, you need to like make a profit off these people for some reason.
It has to do with the perceived value of
Yeah,
the thing
yeah,
that they're
it's sort
receiving,
of
whether or not they use it,
Yeah.
probably other things.
If you want to like empower children or empower women to like teach children, it turns out that instead of giving them money, a negative interest rate in the bank, so charging them money to take their money, nets them saving more money in the long run, and less money goes to alcohol and drugs, and like more money can be given at the end of the year and used productively. And it's a bunch of these like really weird things, but
Unintended consequences. Kind of
Yeah.
like the all of the money given to unwed mothers in Chicago, for example, caused the father to separate so that they would get more government money, which sort of broke down the family structure, and it turned into a generation of like welfare people.
yeah, there's consequences. But the idea here is you can kind of approach like being good,
Mhm.
not by like what feels good, but what is actually doing the most good. And so obviously this is coming from people who work in finance. He had a very nice apartment. It was in Battery Park. This was in 2016. His rent was like $22K a month, I think. And so, you know, how do you
money he made working at J Street, or
Yeah, I would say like he obviously made a lot of good financial decisions. He was not spending a large sum of his money on rent. He wasn't like blowing through his money. He just had enough money 2 years out of college that was not a large investment. And you know, you kind of ask like, how is someone who's spending that much money also saying they're trying to be the best person? And this whole ethical altruism framework, I think is demonic, but it kind of has like a logical sense to it. And he would say like, oh, you know, I'm super smart, I'm good at math. I could be like a really good doctor or a really good scientist.
Mhm.
And if I went and I became a really good doctor, a really good scientist, especially a doctor because of kind of the American Medical Association, there's a finite number of doctors because it's a kind of controlled supply. There's a finite number of residency slots. So if he was a doctor, it's not like there'd be one more doctor. The worst doctor, who maybe was really happy to get into a low-tier medical school, is now kicked out. He has to go do something else. His life is ruined. And now Sam is a doctor. And maybe he's a marginally better doctor. Maybe not, though. And now you have a situation where like Jane Street's still going to hire someone. So it's going to hire maybe someone with less ethical scruples. And maybe that person's not going to donate any money to charity. So it's like, if you're marginally better than the next guy who would replace you, to a larger degree than if you replace someone else doing actual charity, then you're doing a good thing by staying, making lots of money and partying in New York because you're partying less than someone else. And it like checks out. Like it is true. Like more good or more money is being donated to these causes or something. But I think it like rots your soul. Like it's not emotionally satisfying to say that. And that at a high level is like my view of like ethical altruism. He ended up defrauding people of billions of dollars and is now in jail. But
yeah,
I think it started probably with this because he was very nice when I met him, and he kind of went down this philosophical rabbit hole more and more. And I'm attributing, I think, maybe his increasing lack of concern with people as a sort of, oh, sure, I'm defrauding people, but I'm going to like do good with this money. And I think he had a lot of like political kickbacks.
Ethical altruism sounds like it has certain complexity to the logic that, if you probably spin it the right way, could justify just about anything that you might want to do.
Yeah, like it's you know, if someone is going to defraud all these people of money, and I give 0.1% of it to charity, well, I might as well be the one doing it because it's going to happen anyways. And this is the best possible outcome. And yeah, you can justify almost anything. And I think that's, in hindsight, like not something you really think about because you kind of assume everyone has the best intentions. And I think everyone started that way with the best intentions. But yeah, you asked about also, I don't know if you put the Bernie thing in the chat.
Yeah, you guys are both canvassing for Bernie.
No, he was not.
Oh, he wasn't?
No, he definitely was not. I canvassed Bernie Sanders in New York, or in Queens specifically, just because, you know, $22,000 a month is a lot for rent.
Yeah.
And I think most people are very familiar with, you go to school, you make more money. You study harder, you make more money. You work harder, you make more money. If you work harder and you went to school, you make even more money. And there's this kind of gradual progression where this is where like libertarians or capitalists or someone comes in and goes, yeah, like the reason why this person makes more money is like his skills are in more demand. And we need to like maintain paying doctors more so we don't die on the operating table or something. And this is all true, but sort of irrelevant. Because most people are not aware that the actual like people, like the 1%, people making all the money, people with political power, aren't making more money because they're smarter and working harder. They're extracting that money from either something usury related or just from owning something.
Yeah.
And having also gone to prep school, I've been exposed my whole life to this class of people that their wealth is not at all related to like their virtue, their work ethic, anything. It's just something they have.
Yeah.
And that makes me, or made me, very sympathetic to this sort of Bernie Sanders style, like we need to tax these people. Because when I heard tax the rich, I never thought like tax a lawyer, tax a doctor, tax like the high-paying, highly paid like software engineers. Like that never really, like I never thought that. I just thought like, oh yeah, tax the people that pay more than, you know, 20K in rent. That's probably, you don't need to pay that. Or, you know, if you're making 7 figures at 24, no. And if you're making this from like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with high frequency trading.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I actually did it for a while.
How?
Believe it or not. Oh, I did day trading.
But you did like a connection to the exchange?
Yeah.
Where'd you live?
No, I didn't have a direct connection. Obviously, the high frequency is happening probably a lot faster than like the typical day traders connection.
Yeah. So like when you're a day trader, right?
What, back in 1990.
So sort of the other side, right? You're the person losing money in this. If I want to buy like a stock for $5, I don't say I'm buying it for $5. I'm giving some sort of bid. So I'm buying it between like $4.99 and $5.01. And someone's willing to sell it for between $4.98 and $5.01. And someone can come in and be like, hey, I have access to both of these orders coming in on the wire. I can I can buy from the person selling it and sell to you and like make that penny.
So I wasn't doing that. No,
this serves no value.
Yeah.
It's just
day trading also serves no value. It doesn't.
Yes. And trading in general. There is some argument for like market liquidity, and like people are more likely to invest in a company and invest in stocks if they can sell the stock in the future. So the market for equities has to be a certain liquid to a certain enough degree to facilitate investment.
Sounds like the kind of argument that you would make in that quantitative ethics.
Yeah, no, I mean, like that's the argument that the high frequency firms make. And I think like you don't need trades to happen every second. I think it's fine to be like, I invested in, let's say, Klinkhammer Cheese Company. I bought some stock and I'm going to sell it. And maybe it takes me a day or two to sell it. I don't think that's a significant problem. I don't think you need to be able to sell it in a couple seconds. Yeah, so I'm kind of, yeah, but I don't think day traders add any
Probably
value.
like if it were me trying to assess the ethics of these kinds of behaviors, I would question, what are you trying to accomplish ultimately? And most likely it's the pursuit of money for the sake of money or for the sake of power or something like that. And I think there's just better things to be the base of what you are pursuing.
Yeah, these people have like a demonic level of greed, I think. And it's possible, you know, some of them want to spend the money on good things and such things, but I think that I have kind of alternated on this at different parts of my life, dated people in finance, but ultimately, I think all the financialization kind of trading things are not the most, they're just not like ethical life options.
Yeah.
I'll consider them for enough money. Everyone has their, I don't know if that's true. But I can see why people do it, but I don't think it's a good thing. And I think it's objectively bad for society for so many smart people to just be like making money on such useless things.
Now, from personal experience, like the best I have ever felt, period, the most alive, the most happy, joyful, confident, hopeful, just, you know, is basically just in a stable and continuing way, felt extremely good about life and about people and about myself and about just really good attitude, really good, whatever, state of mind, is when you can do something that is helpful to someone and there is like no reciprocation whatsoever. Like I happen to have a skill to be able to make a huge impact on a person, something they wouldn't have been able to do for themselves. And I walked away having done the good thing, right? And this is, of course, the love your neighbor ethic that Jesus is really living out, and how he justifies loving your neighbor and not worrying about the reciprocation is the claim of divine providence. You know, why are you worried about your life, what you're going to eat or drink? Or your heavenly Father knows that you need these things. He will provide for you. Now, if you're going to live out that ethic and not worry about where your provision is coming from, then the Christian atheist approach kind of doesn't work, because it depends on the reality that if you don't know where your money is going to come from, God is simply going to provide it for you. Now, I've lived this out and I've seen that it is real. And so, like, I don't have a struggle with believing in God or something like that. God flat out shows up and provides for you when you need it. Just it happens. Like I lived for the past year without an income, and somehow we kept our house, and you know, things have just worked out in miraculous ways. And prior to that, like I have so many stories about just miraculous ways that God has provided. And synchronicity is a word that gets used to describe like the experiences you're having with setting up your cheese making business.
Can be a thing.
God seems to be opening doors for you, right?
How big of an audience do you need before we can start like shilling cheese to people?
Yeah, who wants to buy cheese? Klinkhammer Cheese Co.
Yeah. Although I think, if I went to sell it outside of Idaho, I'd have to make it with regular milk.
Yeah.
Unless RFK does something.
Oh yeah, that's. I have high hopes that he's gonna like just make it a popular idea that the base of the food pyramid should not be carbohydrates. Like there are people close to me who still like make excuses for the choice to eat nothing but carbohydrates, and it's like
they do taste good.
I don't
They're
think
poison
so.
though.
Like I don't like stuff that's fried in vegetable oil, and I don't like carbohydrates. Is that weird?
Vegetable oils are like oils and fats, but like vegetable oils are also poisonous.
Yeah,
but
vegetable oils and carbohydrates, especially like bleached flour, just it's poison. Like I can see an argument for eating a certain amount of whole grains in your diet if it's like a small portion of your diet, and the majority of your diet is things like healthy fats and proteins and fibers and things like that.
I think a lot of the questions I have are around like rice, beans, and potatoes.
Yeah.
Like, did people eat those because they were poor, or are those something I should be eating? And,
I don't know. There's some big thing about leptins and beans causes leaky gut syndrome. Yeah, maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know. My philosophy towards health is when you like really throw out of balance the quantities of certain kinds of things. So like if you took just like a mountain of beets and refined it down to nothing but like pure white sugar, then you suddenly have something that does occur in nature, but does not occur in these quantities. And so, like, the more processed something is, processing foods, I think, is like radically throwing off quantities from what they are in the way that they exist in nature. So, like, if you ate nothing but fish sandwiches every day for a year, you're getting like an unusually large quantity of like fish and bread, and that's probably bad. And if you're eating anything fried in vegetable oil, well, think of what you have to do to vegetables to get vegetable oil, as opposed to olive oil, which you just squeeze the olive and it comes out. Like
It's a process, but yeah.
it is, yeah, it's very little processing to get oil out of olives. And it apparently, numerous studies have proven that olive oil is like way healthier than vegetable oils, and that kind of thing. So I like to mix it up. I like to eat lots of variety, and I like to eat things closer to the quantities that they occur in nature, right? And it seems to be working really well for me, and I don't have to put a whole lot of thought or energy into diet. I just, it's kind of like moderation.
Yeah, when I'm did a lot of driving for the past year, and when I'm like on the road and I eat crappy food, it's literally just the food they're selling like at gas stations or in restaurants, like to everyone that everyone's consuming.
Yeah.
It just like immediately you start putting on weight and you feel terrible. And it's like, this is probably what the average American is just eating.
Mhm.
And then when I'm here, it's like, oh, I'm going to like go to the butcher or like get a large amount of meat and like eat real food. And you can just like feel yourself get better almost instantly.
Yeah, I also believe, and you could just see that this is the case. If you go down to like CDA Coffee Co., you're going to see really athletic people who are also very successful and who are smart and who are nice. And most of them are doing Bible studies. And it's just like the quality of people is kind of impressive. Nobody's overweight, really. Nobody's super poor. Maybe it's just because it's hard to live in Coeur d'Alene or something. It takes a lot of money to live here. Maybe that's it. But then you go like a mile and a half to the west into Washington, which is a blue state, and suddenly like everybody has blue hair and they're like wearing sweatpants and their bellies hanging out and they're like just obese. And what is that association? It's like super. I think a big part of it is eating lots of carbohydrates makes you like screws up your hormones and makes it impossible for you to think straight and makes you more like open to, I don't know. There's definitely a correlation between a lack of self-discipline and being a blue-haired obese freak. Really. And it probably a bit of correlation and a bit of cause that if you just believe what the government tells you and the government tells you you should be eating mostly carbs and you eat mostly carbs, then it makes it impossible for you to think very clearly, makes you fat and screws up all your hormones and makes you more likely to engage in weird sexual things.
People are also risk averse. So like if you've grown up your whole life being told that like butter is like really bad for you, it's like very hard to like cook with butter. Like you've had some of my like nicer cooking things. I like made some like beef Wellington and a nice little Black Forest cake for my family. And my mom was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you like put butter in it." And it's just like, I'm very confident that vegetable oils, like if I substitute them all, would just be like killing you. People have had butter for like thousands of years. We'll be fine.
Yeah.
But it's just overcoming these like food kind of taboos is like very difficult. Like there's a taboo, I think, against red meat, against butter in some of these people's minds.
Yeah.
That's
Well, I grew up, like I remember my brother who was doing all this research on nutrition saying, well, as long as you don't eat fats, you'll be super healthy. You don't have to worry about gaining weight. So like you can eat as much as you want of things like potatoes and white rice because they don't have any fat in them. It's like, that was like what I believed. And my parents also believed. And so we had tons of like mashed potatoes and white rice all the time. Margarine on everything and artificial sweeteners. It's like, because this is healthy. And my mom was like, yeah, we eat super healthy in our house, artificial sweeteners, margarine, white rice, and potatoes. It's like, yeah, it's completely insane, you know, because like I understand now that healthy is things like eat an avocado and some butter, and even a piece of bacon is like better than white rice. I understand bacon is probably not the healthiest kind of meat that you can eat, but like bacon is probably better than like a bagel with margarine on it.
Yeah, I mean, there's always studies that are like, yeah, like red meat is bad for you, but you look into it and it's like it's only ever like bacon with oodles of nitrates. Like,
Yeah,
no one ever actually, I think,
studies like
steelmans the
right. Or
carnivore side.
you know, if you look at somebody who is eating a lot of red meat smothered in barbecue sauce, barbecue sauce is a ton of processed things and a bunch of sugars and things like that, and it's like, yes, that is bad for you, but probably if you ate the same red meat with like a dry rub and not a ton of sugar on it, it'd end up being really healthy. So,
That's what it is.
you know, I do I make a point of always mentioning Warren McGrew of Idol Killer. When I do my videos, I try to mention him every time. So I've done that now, and but with that, there's a thing that like there's a ton of channels that are like anti-Calvinist channels. You have like Leighton Flowers, who he doesn't know that he's a Calvinist, at least in some ways, because he still believes in like penal substitution theory, which is like you don't have to have that if you get rid of total gravity. So and it's dumb anyway, and it also sort of opens the door for all of the weird ideas about God being this irrational, legalistic kind of being who like created this legal loophole by punishing Jesus. And like that stuff comes from Calvinism. Just get rid of that. Leighton Flowers won't do that. But like most of these channels that are like anti-Calvinist channels, trying to be courteous to Calvinists and also trying to be more appealing or something, or I don't know, just kind of seems passive to me. They'll say, I consider him to be a Christian brother, even though he's Calvinist leaning. It's like, no, you need to stop doing that. Like, Calvinists are not Christians. Like, Christianity is a thing. Calvinism is a completely different thing. They're not even close to the same thing. They're not in the same universe. They do share some things, like Mormons, for example, they have Bibles. Catholics, they have some version of the Bible, right? And so Protestants and Catholics have some similarities. Mormons and Calvinists have some similarities. But following Christ is a different thing than smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, and talking about how you're chosen because you can articulate the Westminster Confession of Faith. That's not, like, that is a completely separate thing. Like a goat is a different thing than like going skydiving. Going skydiving is not a goat.
Yeah, I think I agree. There are a lot of these sort of bureaucracies that just like exist, and then there's
following Christ. Like,
yeah, like going to the gym is closer to being a Christian than being a Calvinist, because it involves like self-transformation and desire to like be better. Like I view them very different categorically. Like one is a social club or a weird company, and the other is like a worldview.
yeah,
but I think also there's something to be said for what we'll just call this the like being more Christ-like YouTube pipeline. It probably is helpful to. I don't think you win any friends by going up and just saying you're immediately not Christian. I think like one discovers, your content by like going down a rabbit hole, so to speak.
yeah.
Like I wouldn't demand like this sort of purity testing from everyone. I think there's value to because this whole idea of like being covered in the blood and penal substitution is like very important to people.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like you just kind of surround these people with community. You get them acting a little nicer, and you just kind of be like, well, you could keep acting nicer. You don't need to be, and you don't need to like just immediately come at them with, like, does it work? not sure if the fruits of arguing with people like that is good. I think
It
there's
totally depends on how you do it.
yeah.
Every case is different. You have to be very discerning. If I just started like barraging you with one particular idea and making demands for you out of context without sensitivity to what's interesting to you, evangelism is often that. It's people with like absolutely no social skill sort of canvassing for their church to try to get people to join their church and given some tract, which a tract is maybe not written in a way that is going to mean anything to this guy over here. Like he's not familiar with any of these words. And so it's just not going to appeal to him. And so tracts are kind of useless in the sense that they do not allow for the dynamic reality of people are all very different. So I don't know, to be good at evangelism, I think is just to have discernment about people and to be able to have meaningful conversations with people and also to take a genuine interest in people. Like I remember one of the first times I went out with a group to do evangelism and I was immediately just hugely successful and nobody else was. And I had no idea why, because I was like homeschooled. I had no social skills. And I think that was part of why I was successful, because I was genuinely interested in like what's going on with this world that I've never encountered before. It's like I remember walking up to this dude who was like all black makeup and piercings everywhere and like a demon on his shirt and all this stuff. And I was like, hey, I'm with a group of people that were talking to people about God or something like that. He's like, oh, really? Well, I'm a Satanist. I was like, oh, what is that all about? And he just starts talking to me and I was like, oh, well, this group of people that I'm with think this. And I had these experiences. And we talked for like hours. And it was a great conversation. And he was like, so you're a Christian? Really? Like, that's not the impression that I got of what a Christian was. And I was like, I don't know. But it was mostly that. It was like just genuinely interested in people, which I think is kind of a Christ ethic or Christ-like ethic, right? To like actually care about what people.
Yeah, I think if you approach people trying to be like a little Christ in your behavior, and I guess I wouldn't even say to approach people. I would say you try to be more Christ-like. And if the Christ-like thing to do is to approach someone, then you kind of want to do it. I think it's totally backwards. Just be like, you're a member of this church. You need to like knock on this many doors and distribute this many tracts and things.
Yeah, then you're just a tool of the bureaucracy, and you're not even doing Christianity. So it's probably completely accurate to say 90% of evangelism is just people who are tools of some bureaucracy trying to increase the size of a bureaucratic organization.
Yeah.
Can't disagree.
I'm sure the average person would agree as well, just because like their denomination is different, but all the other ones are doing that. But there is a certain, no one really focuses on being more Christ-like.
Yeah, I've brought this up before, and it still just sickens me that at Real Life, like in their discipleship handbook, they define discipleship as having spiritual children. And so if you are mature and you have made disciples, it means you've had spiritual children, because that's what making disciples is. And making the disciple is basically when you find somebody who is not a member of Real Life and you persuade them to become a member of Real Life. That's how you attain Christian maturity. This is how you make disciples. And it's like, where in that do we mention things like being honest or like loving your neighbor or helping your neighbor or being aware of the needs of your community and engaging in it, or like seeing someone who is in sin and helping them to understand the long-term consequences and help them to develop sort of that gut aversion to that sin, or anything that has to do with discipleship is just completely out. But then if you can get it subconsciously in someone's mind that discipleship is getting people who are not members of Real Life to become members of Real Life, and then anytime you see that word discipleship in the Bible, you're thinking, oh, I need to get more people to be members of Real Life, then you've just turned the Bible into a tool that you are exploiting in order to increase the size of the bureaucratic organism.
Makes me think, not sure if you've mentioned sort of the church services we run on the other videos, but it's one reason I really like the whole summary thing. And so the TLDR for how I sort of run my church services is we have kind of one screen of what the Bible is saying, and then I don't have anyone give, and people really want to, like their interpretations or what's going on. I just have people give like their summary. Like more, it's like an English assignment more than it is like a theology one. And when you take words like disciple and you ask people what it means, people are going to be like real life. But if you change that to like Jesus wants you to go out and teach people, like people don't associate teaching with real life. It's like there's specific buzzwords that trigger this like part of your brain that just injects theology. And when you don't read those words, I find people like can actually discuss the idea.
Yeah.
And so if you just never see the word disciple in whatever text you're reading, you're just not going to think I need to recruit people to this particular bureaucracy.
Yeah. So I did a video recently on the word ordained in a place that it appears like nobody uses the word ordained outside of some formal organization, and usually it's a religious word, right? Like I don't recall ever using the word ordained in normal conversation when you could just as easily say I planned something, or I made it a goal, or maybe I appointed somebody to a task. I might see the word appointed, but that's even a little bit more formal than we would normally use. And it becomes really, really easy for like a Calvinist to inject election into the word ordained because it sounds like a theological word. But the people who would use that word, like if we had GPS back then, they would have used that word to say, I ordained a destination in my GPS so that I could be sure to get there. Just means to like plan to do something or to, yeah. And there's a ton of words that are like that. Sacrifice. Literally, they were thinking butchered. Like we would say butchered, and it gets translated into English as sacrifice, and all just theology gets injected into it.
It's kind of like the opposite of the people who say like every word of scripture is God breathed. I do maintain that you can like, if there's a list of like 3 things, like you need to be holy, kind, this, you should be able to just X out anything in the list and get the general gist of what it's trying to tell you. And similarly, like you should be able to replace things with synonyms and still get it. Say it's not divinely inspired, but I don't think anything hinges on individual words.
There's a passage in Ephesians that's one of the penal substitution proof texts that says, through him we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. And that's just packed with penal substitution words like redemption. Redemption, people are thinking Jesus redeemed us by offering himself as an atoning sacrifice and all that stuff. And forgiveness of sin is like God is now legally able to forgive us because he's gotten his requisite blood. But redemption comes from the word lutro, I think, which means to loose. So you could literally use it to like untie a boat, or freedom. Things that are hooked together are now gone, and you're hooked to your sin. You're living a life enslaved to greed or something like that, and you have now freedom from that. You've been loosed from that greed, lust, hatred, thirst for power, whatever. And then forgiveness is the word aphesis, which is it's a synonym for lutro. It's things parting. And so it's just restating the same thing. You were a slave to your sin, and now you're free from your sin. It has nothing to do with like all the legalese, theological, God had to get his blood stuff that people are injecting into the word redemption, which sounds like a religious word, and the English word forgiveness, which sounds like God is now like letting go of his bitterness or something.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of this covered in the blood stuff that's just kind of like a weird blood cult that, like, if you don't grow up in it, just kind of gives you the ick. Like, it would never occur to me to ever like seriously entertain any worldview that involves like being covered in the blood for some weird mystical reason.
Yeah.
And I think it's like very normalized in Christian circles, and like even now you're talking about it as if it's like a remotely normal idea, but it's just like not.
Yeah.
Like,
It's also worth noting that there's like never anywhere in scripture any idea of like being covered in blood. It's like those words don't even occur together.
It's really weird, but then when you add in the whole like we need to kill innocent people to like wear their blood as a disguise to like continue committing crimes, it's like that's not really a group you want to be a part of. And when that group starts saying like these are our moral proclamations for how you should be living, it's just like that's fundamentally why everyone's like these Christians are just like hateful and weird, because it's just like a very weird ideology.
Yeah.
It's like not really like trying to maintain that you're like all about loving your neighbor. But if my neighbor was perfect, I could kill him and wear his blood. Is like very odd. Like there's no part of that that like makes any sense.
There's no part either of like God can't forgive you until he like stomps a kitten to death. Like what? How was that even?
Find this concept. People watch these things.
Oh.
I've watched your videos, so I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, and it's what's really weird is that people will watch like all 5 hours of an interview like this. It's like, but I mean, people watch 4-hour Joe Rogans all the time, so because they're doing other stuff and they just have it playing in the background. When I came to like the first Bible study that you did, I think at that time you would have said you were an atheist, probably.
No.
I don't know. Like it was never 100% clear to me. Were you kind of agnostic at that point, or maybe it doesn't matter?
I think philosophically I've always been agnostic, which in popular terms can be an atheist or agnostic depending on something.
Yeah. Maybe it doesn't matter because you didn't grow up with the brainwashing that comes from growing up in like going to church every Sunday and hearing sermons where they're like giving you an idea that faith means something that it obviously didn't mean to the people in the Bible. And the same thing with like forgiveness and sacrifice and atonement and propitiation. Like you get brainwashed into like injecting a whole bunch of theology into these words that the authors of scripture obviously never intended. And you didn't have any of that. So when you were reading the Bible in your Bible studies, like I'd feel the same temptation to stop and explain, no, that, and like you just didn't have any of that. You immediately understood it exactly the same way that I did, which I was like hugely relieved. And I stopped feeling that urge to like stop you every few seconds and try to get you to be deprogrammed from all that Protestant brainwashing that I thought would just be there for some reason.
Yeah, it's just kind of not. There's always, I think, some value in like reading your Bible more and discussing it more, but at the same time, like it's not a super complicated, especially the New Testament is just not a complicated book. And the Old Testament, if you read it in any translation, that's like easy to read. Set of stories, and there's not really a lot of mystery to it. It doesn't require too much explanation to read and to understand. And even all the times when there's like the word ordained or the word redeemed, these are fundamentally proof texts for a particular kind of Calvinist ideology or something, but they're not something that you would organically think while reading it. So you can read it. You should be a good person and you're going to be redeemed of your sins. And then you should be a good person. And it's like, all right, it's like, maybe it's a poetic license, but I'm just like kind of reading through and I don't start thinking about any of these atonements or however that would apply. So it doesn't really need explanation. Like, it's interesting to read and to hear from you being like, oh, other people think these things, but it's like, these other people don't actually think this while reading it. They are told this, they are quoted this out of context, and then they probably never really read it.
Yeah.
And so it's very odd. Yeah, I definitely didn't. Yeah, I don't know how you would get that sort of perspective without actually like going to church and just sort of listening.
I think part of the reason that a lot of these like atonement theories, you don't need it for anything. Like if you are honest with yourself and you read through the Like one of the times that I read through the New Testament, I just put this question on paper: who actually goes to heaven? Now let's read the New Testament and take every verse that talks about that and copy and paste it. And overwhelmingly, hundreds of cases, the people who go to heaven are the people who are righteous. What does it mean to be righteous? It means that you don't steal, lie, commit murder, commit adultery, etc. And your life is marked by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, virtue, wisdom, honesty, etc. And you just pull out like 1 Corinthians 6, Galatians chapter 5, Ephesians chapter 5. Do not be deceived, adulterers, liars, people who do these things do not inherit eternal life. And then like Matthew, whichever one it is, Jesus gathered the sheep and the goats, the people who like visited those who were sick or in prison, or they like clothed the naked or fed the hungry. These are the people who will inherit eternal life. So it's like you will never from the New Testament get this idea that the people who believe in penal substitution go to heaven, the people who reject it don't.
Yeah, I had a discussion with a sort of Catholic, which they kind of believe something similar to total depravity, and they're like, well, if you think only like people who are, not having sin and are righteous go to heaven, like that's going to be a small number of people. And I'm like, the way is narrow. And then they're like, well, do you think you'll make it? I'm like, yeah, probably not. No. And I think a lot of it also comes down to one sort of view of hell. And I've always, before being religious, kind of maintained sort of annihilationist view, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think the Bible does sort of support that. Like the reward is eternal life. It's not, like, doesn't really say like if you don't do this, you get eternally painful life.
Yeah.
And I think when you change it to a reward system and not an infinite punishment, it becomes something where like it removes a lot of objections, right? Because it's like, well, why does like God hurt all those people who like haven't heard about him? It's like, well, he doesn't. They just don't. If you don't hear about the concert, you can't go to the concert. But it's not like we're going to come to your house and torture you forever.
I'm not opposed to believing that heaven and hell is maybe kind of an extreme or sort of pictorial way of illustrating certain ways of living are sustainable and others aren't. One of the things you said in the beginning of this conversation was like what part of what attracted you to the Christian ethic was a society where people respect each other's property. Well, it's sustainable. A society where you just steal whatever you want all the time, it's like it breaks down, turns into chaos. Everybody gets sick and dies, right?
It's that near total depravity, or like everyone can be super sinful and then not be given eternal life and go to heaven. Doesn't like make God evil if there is no hell. So the standard that God can set for getting into heaven can be like you need perfect behavior, and we're not cheating it with any like covering with the blood things. And as long as you're not getting like basically punished for just being normal, then you can have this really high standard. And so it's like it's just sort of okay for me. Like it doesn't seem like God is a bad person for being like, no, you actually do have to be Christ-like to achieve eternal life, because
you're shooting for the moon, you do better.
No, it's like being set to a near impossible task for an infinite reward is totally fine. Being set to a near impossible task and then having an infinite punishment if you don't reach it seems very mean. And so I'm kind of curious if that influences my like total willingness to accept this kind of you must try to be Christ-like, and I guess I'm even okay with this, like people are sinful or wicked. It's like, well, if that's true, like we just got to try harder. And as long as there's no super negative punishment, it's like, all right, whatever.
There is a really important point that it's actually one of the reasons that Paul is becoming increasingly controversial. There's kind of a big movement now to reject all of the teachings of Paul.
Wait, actually?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's some YouTubers who have millions of views who are like going out of their way to make this argument. Now they have millions of views for other reasons, but like they have millions of views and they're hugely opposed to Paul, and it's kind of an increasing thing. And what they're doing is they're taking all of the things that Paul said about salvation by faith and saying it's absurd because why would God have to punish his own son? Which I'm just going like, well, you're not understanding. You're thinking that when Paul says faith, he means believing in penal substitution. And this is what the reformers are telling you. This is what all of Protestantism is telling you. But that's not actually what Paul is saying. What he is saying is you do not become a righteous person who has righteous feelings, thoughts, and deeds by obeying the laws of Moses. Like you can not work on the Sabbath for 100 years and it is not going to make you like less greedy. You can offer like a sacrifice of your mint and your cumin and your herbs and tithe all that stuff, and you can wear like scriptures pasted to your head and all that stuff, and it is not going to make you be less hateful. But there is a way that you can become less hateful, less greedy, less whatever, more loving, more compassionate, and that is by changing your faith. Now, faith has come to mean a lot of dumb things to people who are listening to mainstream Christianity. But faith, when it's used in the scripture, it has to do with your perception, like the way that you're thinking, your model of the world that exists in your mind, the way that you think things are. Now, if you think things are such that you have to lie, cheat, and steal, you navigate by Machiavellian ethic in order to gain as much power as possible, then guess what? You're going to be greedy and hateful and lying and cheating and stealing, and like some people that we know who are Machiavellians. But if you understand that God promises to provide for you, and you've taken the teachings of Jesus about the Father's faithfulness to you and that you don't need to worry about those things, if you take those things to heart, you believe them, then that gives you a significant amount of freedom to be more altruistic without fearing the consequences of not having lots of power and accumulated wealth and resources and things like that. So the idea that we are rescued from our sin by changing the things that we believe is perfectly in line with what Jesus taught about how you make the tree good and the fruit will also be good. You make the tree good not by like obeying laws or practicing certain rituals. You make the tree good by reprogramming, which goes along with the word repent is actually meta-neo, which is meta, just like above or whatever, like meta conversation, metacognition. And then neo refers to the mind. So it's like, take your current mind out and look at it, realize how dumb it is, and get a different one. Meta-neo is, I would say the closest English equivalent would be something like paradigm shift. And it's interesting that Jesus would be like, look, I'm walking on water. You should have a meta-neo. You should have a paradigm shift. Look, I just took 5 loaves of bread and fed 5,000 people with it. You should have a paradigm shift. Look, I just raised this person from the dead. You should have a paradigm shift. And he would usually say, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. You should think differently. Look what I just did. I just defied the laws of physics or whatever.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, for anybody who's toying with this idea of rejecting Paul because Paul supposedly taught Reformed doctrine, what's actually going on is that the Reformers abuse Paul more than anybody else, and they twist Paul more than anybody else. And they're trying to justify dumb stuff like God has to punish somebody innocent. It's a lot of tangents.
Yeah, I think there's various controversy around all sorts of different authors and different books in the Bible. And I tend to take a holistic approach to that and just kind of go like, what Jesus said is probably clear enough to go on.
Yeah. But if you think about where people who are in Protestant churches are kind of sitting emotionally, and I was here for a while, so I understand this. If we have to have exactly the right wording of the doctrine of the Trinity in order to avoid eternal conscious torment, then having exactly the right wording of scripture and exactly the right books that are included and excluded from the canon becomes like the most important thing, period. Because it's a question of, am I going to perish for all of eternity in in conscious torment in hell, being burned alive and having my eyes bitten out by snakes and any other horrible thing that you can imagine, if I like get the wrong wording of the Trinity, or I like pick the wrong books of the Bible or whatever. So then the view of inspiration, every word of God is inspired, and making sure you have the right books, all that stuff becomes like super, super important. But if Christ likeness is really the measure, then it kind of doesn't matter if like maybe the book of Ephesians isn't canon.
If you ask them like, why does your Bible not contain like First and Second Maccabees? Like, how do they respond to that?
That the canon of which was like 300 AD, and this is like post Holy Roman Catholic, and there's political reasons that books were included in it. They don't know any of that kind of stuff. They just assume that event is part of historic Christianity, which everybody has just generally good feelings about historic Christianity. And so they have generally good feelings about, well, they also have generally good feelings about the Protestant Reformation and the people who are involved in that. And the Bible that they have in their hands that they're taking to church came from historic Christianity, giants of the faith like Luther, who did all this work for the Bible. There's generally good energy around the Protestant canon. It's kind of all that there is.
What about like, I think it's like Maccabees 3 and 4. Like there's books that are in like the Orthodox Bibles, but they're not in the Catholic Bibles.
I've seen some. I've like witnessed arguments between Protestants and Orthodox where the Orthodox are pointing out that like righteousness is actually necessary for salvation, and the Protestants are like, no, righteousness is impossible. It's all a matter of putting your faith in Jesus' righteousness. And they're like reading books from whatever the Orthodox version of the canon is that emphasizes the importance of like works and things. And so the Protestants today are sort of rejecting some of the Orthodox. I don't remember exactly which books are in the Orthodox canon, but they're rejecting some of that canon based on the fact that there's like an emphasis on like actual righteousness.
I mean, looking at that just sort of in a non-biased way, it's like these books have been around for thousands of years, and then you like got rid of them. I guess it's possible Martin Luther is like the next thing, but it's weird they keep the part of the Bible that says
well, like Luther wanted to get rid of the book of James because it says faith without works is dead, right? He hated that book. And Luther basically came up with the 5 solas. I don't know if he did that alone, but like the 5 solas include salvation by faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone, or something like that. And it just basically puts all of the responsibility on God to get you saved. And of course, the Calvinists kind of articulate that a little more. And even the believing is something that God just does to you, which is why they teach the whole regeneration precedes faith. Total.
Yeah, they're like just very determinist, I guess.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know, we're beating the dead horse at this point.
Yeah, no. So, any other questions? Getting kind of hungry.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. We could end it here if you want to, unless you have any other thoughts.
Is there anyone still? Oh, there's 5 people still watching.
Oh, that's sweet.
They.
Somebody mentioned that there are more books than the Masoretic Hebrew text, maybe in the Orthodox Bible. Yeah, I'm gonna have to go and look that up now. There's a lot of stuff I don't know off the top of my head.
It's just one of those like. The question of like which books are there is a really complicated one, I suppose. If you think that either church tradition or sola scriptura are like super important. But I don't think there's anything that complicated in what Jesus said. So if you replace one of the books with another, or you don't have apostolic Catholic Church to guide you, I don't think it's very difficult to find out what Christ was saying.
I also don't think that it's difficult, and maybe this is just me, but like, let's say you're at Home Depot and you see some old lady trying to lift a really heavy box into her car. Do we, like, A, stop and help her, pray for her, rejoice that we're a chosen Calvinist and she's not? Like, what do we do there? You know, and when Jesus says, love your neighbor is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, like all the law is summed up in this. It's like you see the person who needs help and you stop and you help them, right?
The steelman counterpoint that I've heard from Catholics is that there are some questions where you're like, what is the good thing to do? And are you going to trust everyone to reason through it? And basically it's people are retarded, therefore you need someone to tell them like what's right and wrong.
Yeah, and I think that any hierarchy has some kind of argument like that.
And my response to that is, I agree. You need this. I am very glad. I will pray for it.
We'll accept the tithing, right?
I mean, I'm not going to tithe to your organization because I am not someone who needs this help thinking, but I understand the general utility of it.
Yeah, and you would accept it.
And of course, once they hear that, it's like, no, the Heritage Hillside has accepted some tithes.
Yeah, no, I've actually, since we were doing it at my house, some of that money went to helping me buy breakfast for people.
Yeah, I think it's I was actually struggling with the dilemma of job change. So I've had work laptops since grad school, so for 8-9 years. And I was like, I'm going to buy my own laptop. And it's like, but the laptop is used for church things.
So could you
And
use
if I had a 501(c), I'd be able to make a purchase. But I decided I'm resolutely opposed to having a 501(c) officially filed. So
yeah.
I'm not going
to
do
like
it.
the idea of the government having some level of control over what you're allowed to say.
Yeah, I don't think you can restrict your preaching in order to comply with local laws and claim to be serving God and not money.
Yeah. An interesting note about all these weird doctrines. What we're doing with Heritage Hillside, where we open the Bible, we have people like, reword this, and everybody participates, and it's kind of like, this isn't complicated, it's like you were living with hatred and envy and stuff, but then you've been like forgiven and set free from your sins. So it's like, oh, well, the idea here is like you stop doing this and you start doing this, and everybody kind of can see that in it, whatever. You would never, like you say, you would never get like, oh, the Father's wrath had to be satiated, and this is what's happening here. Like you would never get that without like the institution. And so, and also the institution, if it's not providing you something that you can't get from just like reading it and talking about it, then what value does it have? So I think for the institution to maintain the illusion that it's providing value, it has to give you something that you couldn't get from the text. And this is where we get all these weird theologies. This is at least part of why all of these weird theologies exist, is because you have to invent them or you stop being relevant. Like if you listen to John MacArthur, for example, he went on for an hour and a half about the 6 words in Genesis 3:21, I think it is, where it says, God made coats from skin. Made up all this stuff about it being a sacrifice and how like there was never death before this. It just went on and on and on. And it's like, you listen to a rabbi comment on the exact same verse, and they say, and God made coats from skin. Well, yeah, because like leather makes better clothing than fig leaves. And then they go on. And it's like, and that is the proper way to deal with that verse. You don't go on, like, you don't make it about penal substitution for an hour.
I've heard people go about modesty. And it's like, you didn't just give them a fig leaf, you gave them a coat. And I'm like, deserts are cold at night. Like, it's just not a complicated thing. Like, you don't have to read any morality into it if you don't want to.
Yeah, they were actually more righteous when they were running around naked. So.
Well, I run naked.
I walk around.
Yeah, I never run anywhere naked, I suppose. That's true.
Drive.
Can you drive naked? Is that allowed?
I think if you put a COVID mask on, you'd be fine.
Uh,
Some North Idaho dude's like, "What are you wearing a mask for in the car? I'm not wearing anything else."
yeah, it is.
Yeah, North Idaho is funny. I think like in North Idaho, it's not just lesbians who drive Subarus here. There's a lot of snow, and Subarus have a good 4-wheel drive.
I don't even think that it's true that lesbians are disproportionately likely to drive Subarus. I think that lesbians live in Oregon and Seattle disproportionately more, and everyone around here drives Subarus because they are just effective.
Yeah, no, I live on a steep, snowy hill, and it's really difficult to drive up it, except with this new. Like you can have totally bald tires, and a Subaru just acts like it's dry pavement. It's so weird. You wouldn't think it'd be possible, but they're amazing.
Hmm.
So
I've never driven one.
Yeah.
I don't even think they're really rental cars either. I don't think I've ever. I've had a lot of them.
yeah. So this episode was sponsored by Subaru. I guess that's all. And I see a lot of people have made comments, so I will go through the live comments and continue some discussion there. Anything else?
No,
All right.
there's nothing.
All right. You said you're hungry, so
Yeah,
I'm gonna go home and listen to some more Corn and
trying to have more self.
watch some South Park with the kids. You know, like a good Christian.
Some of them are too young for it.
Don't tell me how to raise my kids.
I'm telling you.
All right.
I wonder if the internet wants to hear me tell them how to raise their kids.
We can do another video.
Yeah. All of you. I know more.
Yeah, that's that noblesse oblige thing, right? You're the noblesse and they're the oblige. Wait, no, you're oblige because of the noblesse thing. Sorry.
I think everyone should have that attitude of you are somewhat obligated to give and help people because of what you
Yeah.
do.
Okay. So there, that whole you will not hate your brother in your heart. You have to correct them if they're errors. And yeah, it's right there.
Yeah.
All right, we should end it.